there is, like, I allow room that there could be some coincidences. I personally find the convergence turning eastward, which would lead to the
Mhm.
Dhofar region, is that makes it a little bit more compelling to me and a bit more plausible.
It seems to stand to reason to me that these Isaiah passages are being copied, at least as Nephi says, from those brass plates. Now, the problem for that, when we look at like textual anachronisms, in my mind, is that the Book of Mormon's Isaiah passages almost always, I'm sorry, align word for word with the King James Version or the Masoretic text tradition.
But I definitely think this is very plausible, not just that Malchiyahu is identified as being a son of Zedekiah, but that it dates to the right time. So I see this as, surprising if Joseph Smith just made this up.
Is just there really isn't a form of Egyptian that works the way that the Book of Mormon claims. That Hebrew would have appreciably saved space over Egyptian.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores the church's history and truth claims. And this is my third part of having discussions with Kolby Reddish about the Book of Mormon. Kolby, I'm grateful to have you back.
Yeah, me too, Stephen. Thanks for having me this morning.
Yeah, you're almost become my most popular guest in 2026. What's going on with that? Who would have thought?
Yeah, I don't know. I really like our conversations. I think we had a lot of fun last weekend talking about the lawsuit with the panel, and yeah, I've enjoyed our Book of Mormon conversations, and I think we've come up with some creative ideas for future conversations if our schedules work out. So I'm
Yeah,
excited.
absolutely. But we're becoming too chummy, so we need to disagree a bit more in
That's
here so
right.
I don't get attacks in the comments again. But
That's
we've done two
right.
previous conversations. We did one on the witnesses of the gold plates, where I talked
Hmm.
about reasons I find them somewhat compelling and reasons why you don't. And the last one, we talked about different translation theories or models of the Book of Mormon, and then naturalistic explanations as well. And this is
Hmm.
going to be a discussion talking about Book of Mormon historicity. And because Book of Mormon historicity is a very large and broad topic, we've decided the best way to cover it in like a 2.5 hour episode is for each of us to take sort of like three topics or 3 points. And we've got some slides prepared and we're going to go through them. There might be a little bit of back and forth and some questions on this, but we're going to hopefully model this in the same way of our previous discussions. It's going to be civil and respectful. I
Hmm.
imagine there might be a little bit more disagreement in this episode on how we maybe evaluate some of the evidence, but I think it's going to be good to see where we agree and where we disagree
Hmm.
and those sorts of things. But I think where we both would agree is I do think Book of Mormon historicity is integral to the Book of Mormon's claims and divine authenticity. I find it difficult to know how to separate believing the Book of Mormon is inspired and of divine origins from its historical claims, because Joseph claimed he was visited by the angel Moroni, who was a historical prophetic figure in the Book of Mormon, that he received the gold plates and translated them. And if the Book of Mormon's not historical, it's hard for me to believe it could still be inspired, because then either Joseph made up the origin story, made up the plates, or he imagined the angel, or it was a lying angel, or so. But at the same time, I want to allow room for people who believe in the Book of Mormon, who have had spiritual experiences with it, um, that feel that they struggle with the historicity question and struggle to believe it's historical. I still feel that there should be a place for them in the church if they want to be in the church. And if I were someone's priesthood leader, for example, I don't see it as a temple recommend question that you can't be in good standing if you don't believe the Book of Mormon's historical. But for me, that wouldn't work. I don't think my faith would be sustainable. But I want to allow room for people who struggle with Book of Mormon historicity, if they felt like, but I love the Book of Mormon, it brings me closer to God, I've had spiritual experiences, I would say hold on to that and you can figure out historicity later on. Because at the end of the day, I think functionally, most of the time, whenever I read the Book of Mormon, we're doing it sort of for devotional reasons and trying to seek inspiration and connect ourselves to God. But I think we would both agree that I do think the Book of Mormon's historicity is integral to its authenticity.
Yeah, I'm glad you started with this because this is probably, and yeah, I want to leave room for people who believe in the Book of Mormon for any variety of reasons. I mean, what people find meaningful and useful to their lives and to like helping them inculcate the values and principles they want to live by. I really don't care what those things are. I'm more curious about what the principles they're applying are. And there are definitely some good principles that we can pull out of the Book of Mormon, some good lessons, some good Like even if you look at it as purely fiction, there are some good lessons you can pull from fictional characters, and not just the Book of Mormon, right? Like I think there are pieces of fiction that have resonated with me as life lessons, basically my entire life since I read some of those books like Great Gatsby, things like Dune. Like you can pull lessons from completely fictional stories, right? Even Jesus himself taught in allegories and parables.
Right.
And so it's not unsurprising that people connect with those things. But I do appreciate you starting with the question of Book of Mormon historicity because, in my mind, yes, I have always struggled with. I've always struggled with the view that some members have that the Book of Mormon cannot be historical and still remain inspired. Now, of course, I want to leave room for that because whatever people find value in is what they find value in. But in my mind, like Joseph Smith recounts not just direct encounters with the angel, but also direct encounters with artifacts that are in the Book of Mormon's text. So, in my view, it's like if those things aren't historical, and I'm talking specifically about like the plates, the interpreters, and the Liahona, if those things aren't historical, I struggle to like make sense of what this means for Joseph's credibility. So that's just where my mind goes. So at least we kind of agree that Book of Mormon
Yeah.
historicity matters. I think the other thing I'd say, just so that I'm real clear for your listeners as we go through this conversation, and I hope that people who've listened to our last few conversations have gotten this vibe from me, is while I'm going to talk about Book of Mormon historicity and the issues that I see with viewing the Book of Mormon as historical, I understand that there is value and I understand the role of faith that faith plays in people's lives. I think that's one of, since we exchanged kind of talking points ahead of time, I know that's something that you're going to talk about. I don't want to steal your thunder. I just want to say I very much recognize where people go when faith becomes a gap filler to help like carry through something that they might not see as having enough evidence to believe based purely on the evidence. And then it's like where the spiritual experiences and the faith fill in that gap. In my mind, I'm not really going to go there today. That's a different conversation. I'd be happy to have with you a completely different time on like why I don't personally believe that I can use faith or spiritual experiences. We did talk about it a little bit
Probably
in
must
the
be like a
spiritual
separate discussion
witnesses.
on like epistemology in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm just kind of saying I'm going to kind of bracket that part of the discussion. And when I'm
Mm.
talking about historicity, I hope people hear me talking literally about historicity and not do I think the Book of Mormon is good? Do I think the Book of Mormon is valuable? I'm not at all in talking about historicity, trying to challenge or take away any person's faith or anything that's important to someone. What I'm really talking about is like, do I have sufficient evidence to believe this historical narrative in the ways that I would normally um, analyze whether something is historical. So that's kind of my opening little signal of where I look at where the rubber meets the road here.
No, that makes sense. And I'll just say briefly, we don't talk too much about our backgrounds. I imagine yours would have been similar to myself. I would have grown up believing the Book of Mormon was historical. I would have believed it was hemispheric. All Native
Mhm.
Americans were the descendants of the Lamanites, would have believed the Hillcumorah final battles happened in New York. I never would have thought too deeply about historicity, but I would have definitely believed those things. I lost my faith in
Mhm.
Book of Mormon historicity in 2018, siding with the naturalistic explanations and concerns with anachronisms and KJV material and all those sorts of
Mhm.
things. And then when I came back to the church, I don't think I had really figured out like what I believed about Book of Mormon historicity. I came back mostly on like spiritual experiences and believing
Right.
in the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. But if you were to challenge me about like I thought the Nahom Bountiful convergence, which I'll probably talk about first, was interesting,
Mhm.
so I knew about that. But other than that, I still hadn't figured out at that point what I made of Book of Mormon historicity and
Mhm.
geography. But I'm looking forward to talking through some of those things today. Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. Let me know if you can see this. Can you see
I
that?
think so. There we go. Yes.
Okay. Oh, I found this quote from last time when we were talking about Book of Mormon translation. So we'll not spend very long about this, but I remember
Mhm.
you saying that you side more with it has to be a tight translation because a lot
Mhm.
of these scribes and eyewitnesses, people like Martin Harris and David Whitmer, I think even Emma, Joseph Knight Sr., make
Hmm.
the Book of Mormon translation process seem very tight. Like the words are appearing. Joseph's reading the words, the scribe would write them
Right.
down. They couldn't move on until it was written down correctly. And from all the sources I've looked at of Joseph and Oliver, I don't think they really get into the specific of like the mechanics, except for saying it was by means of the Urim and Thummim, by the gift and power of God.
Hmm.
And I actually came across this source. I'm pretty sure I read it before, but I told you in the last episode that I lean a little bit more with the functional translation theory. I'm a little bit agnostic whether he was actually reading words from the stone or if it was facilitating the revelation coming to his mind and he was the one that articulated the words. But I find this interesting source. It's early. It is secondhand, so I'm not saying that this proves that this is
Sure.
matches the functional translation theory. But it's Oliver relating to a Shaker leader, Richard McNamara, and he records the engraving being unintelligible to learned and unlearned, referencing the plates that are said to have
Hmm.
been in the box with the plates, two transparent stones in the form of spectacles through which the translator looked and afterwards put his face into a hat, and the interpretation then flowed into his mind, which he uttered to the amanuensis, that's a tough word, who wrote it down. Now, I don't know if this quote is really like 100% accurate because it's saying that he looked in the spectacles first and then afterwards put his face in a hat, whereas all the other sources I've read is very much either the seer stone or the spectacles were put in a hat. But it's interesting that it talks about like the interpretation would then flow into his mind. And if he's getting this from Oliver Cowdery, Oliver was, the primary participant in the translation process. And this would align a little bit more with sort of the functional or loose translation theory or section 9 that it was some sort of understanding or the interpretation, the meaning of the plates came to Joseph's mind. So I don't know. I just thought I wish I had have mentioned that source in the last one. I don't know if you have any quick thoughts on that, but it's not really too
Yeah,
relevant to
just
our discussion today.
just one quick thought because I did enjoy that conversation we had about the translation methods, and I think maybe loose versus tight translation method is not really where I see the issue. It's more like how active was God and the revelatory process in the final text that was produced. So I guess when I see a quote like this, it very much agrees with what I understand from the other quotes of the scribes and from Joseph himself, the people who are directly involved in the translation project, people you talked about, Emma, David. Joseph really only gave that one statement that we talked about the last time, gift and
Yeah.
power of God. And then Oliver is, I guess I struggle with like the expansion theories, and I don't
Mhm.
remember if you're really an expansion theorist,
No.
but I struggle with those because to me, it's like one thing that's really clear is however the mechanics of the translation worked, everyone involved, I think Joseph included, thought that God was basically directing what ended up on those pages. Maybe not every single word perfectly, but that's kind of always been my understanding. So it's for me, it's not really a difference between like tight and loose translation as far as
Mm.
like the original ancient record is concerned. It's more like how active was God involved in the process. That's where I always go.
Right, okay. And if I were to, how I would read this is I feel like what Oliver, at least what he's saying to the Shaker leader, is that
Hmm.
when he would look at the spectacles and put his face in the hat, it was almost like the interpretation or the understanding of the plates was then given to his mind.
Right.
And then I would take the view that then Joseph, as the translator, had to express it or articulate it with his own language and words,
Sure.
versus someone who would say he just looked on the translation instrument and he was just a reader. Whereas I would read this as there was divine help in understanding what was on the plate text, but he was the translator expressing it, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. More akin to DNC 9. I gotcha.
Yeah. But anyway, I thought I would start. This is sort of my like brief, I would say, epistemology when it comes to the Book of Mormon, and maybe a disclaimer because you wanted to do a debate with someone a while ago on the Book of Mormon, but you're happy to just have a discussion.
Hmm.
And number one, I'm not very good
I've
at
always wanted
debates.
to have more of a discussion than a
I
debate,
think
just because of
discussions
the.
are better because
Yeah.
in debates you're trying to like win against the other person, whereas in a discussion, if you make a good point, it's like, oh, that's a good point. Or if I make a good
Hmm.
point, it's more like it's less formal and it's more of a conversation.
Hmm.
But I personally, although the primary reason I believe in the Book of Mormon is spiritual experience, that's sort of the foundation. I don't see any definitive or conclusive proof for Book of Mormon historicity. And I like this quote from Elder Neil A. Maxwell. He says, this is his opinion, that all the scriptures, including the Book of Mormon, will remain in the realm of faith. Science will not be able to prove or disprove Holy Writ. However, enough plausible evidence will come forth to prevent scoffers from having a field day, but not enough to remove the requirement of faith. And I missed out a portion, but he says, believers must be patient through such unfolding. And I imagine you would disagree. You would probably see some things as, oh no, there's certain truth claims, things which are testable that we can falsify. But I see that there are some compelling or strong historical arguments against the Book of Mormon that I think believers and apologists have to confront and take seriously and not just ignore. But I'm also sort of the opinion, and we'll try to argue in this presentation, that I see some interesting plausible evidence, not enough to say, well, this proves it and there's no need for faith, but enough to say maybe there's some rationality or some plausibility, but this does not remove the necessity for faith or for spiritual experience. So with that disclaimer, all of the topics I'll present, none of them alone is like proof. Like this shows the Book of Mormon is historical. It's more either things that I think are interesting connections or that I think are plausible. Or if I were to go with a naturalistic explanation and that Joseph's the author, it's a 19th century text, those would be the things which I would struggle to account for under that model,
Hmm.
if that makes sense.
Great. Yeah. Hmm.
Okay. So, old world geography. We'll not go super deep in this. I know you did LDS discussions episode on it. I watched Dan Vogel's rebuttal to it, and I did like nearly a 3 hour episode with Neil Rapley on Nahom and Bountiful. So I feel like I don't want to dive deep anymore in this topic, but
Hmm.
you're familiar with this, but Lehi's travel, leaving Jerusalem, coming to the borders of the Red Sea. Faithful scholars have pointed to a plausible candidate, a 3 day journey from the borders of the Red Sea for the Valley of Lemuel, Wadi Taib, Al Yassim, having been this sort of canyon valley and a river or a stream which continually flows into the Red Sea, that they traveled in a southeastern direction. And most faithful scholars reconstruct that likely they would have adopted and followed the incense trail route, following those directions. They talk
Can
about coming
I
to, yeah, go ahead.
can I ask you a question about that
Sure.
piece? I'm hoping it's okay. We just ask questions as we're going through. Is
Yeah,
that
no, that's totally fine.
okay? Um, so I've heard that incense trail argument before. I think one of the things I immediately struggle with about that is that the narrative is really clear that they're trying to, and they're not encountering other people.
Hmm.
Like if they're on, whether it's the frankincense trail or the incense trail, like I'm struggling to understand how that helps increase the historicity question because the narrative is like really clear that they're avoiding other people, they're away from other people. Do you know how likely it would be that you could be traveling this, like, this, I'm assuming pretty well traveled trail in that time period and not encounter anyone the entire journey?
So I would say this, I don't know if they definitely didn't encounter any people the entire journey. I believe it's after they go to Nahom in the journey from Nahom to Bountiful, is that's whenever I think they talk about like,
The
not
meat
lighting
thing.
fires and things in case they get found. But I would see it as that they could have passed certain people on the route. And I know in the video that Dan Vogel did, he sees it as there's some verses that talk about that they stay near the borders of the Red Sea.
Hmm.
And he sees it as, oh, if you read the Book of Mormon, it says that they stayed really close to the borders of the Red Sea or the seashore the whole journey. So it should have been more of a coastal route. And I actually thought that was the
Hmm.
strongest argument that Dan had in his video. And whenever I talked to Neil about it, Neil said, like, up until from Valley of Lemuel to like Shazer, it talks about them staying, in the borders near the Red Sea. But then after that, it says that they followed the same course in sort of a general southeast direction, and there's nothing after that specified that they maintained or stayed on that coastal route. So it's almost like there's possibility or plausibility that they could have gone a little bit further inland if they're following a generic southeastern direction.
Okay.
Does that
Yeah,
make
and
sense?
for what it's worth, I also take Dan's view that one of the reasons I struggle with these maps when I've seen them from other apologetic resources is my understanding. I mean, right here on the slide, like First Nephi 16:14 in the borders near the Red Sea, that's like in the same chapter where then it talks about them coming to Nahom. So
Yes.
I've always understood that they needed to be in the borders near the Red Sea. And it can be difficult to not see it this way when we're looking at a topographical map like or like a map from above like this. But most of this journey is like probably over 100 miles from the Red Sea. And so that's always one of my pieces of difficulty is like, and I understand there's an apologetic about how borders meant mountains, and so they're near the mountains. But I've always struggled with that because it's like, I don't know, if you're 100 miles inland and separated by a giant mountain, I'm not sure I would ever describe that as in the borders near the Red Sea.
Right,
But
no, I understand because that is some apologists have interpreted that the borders mean mountains. Whenever I talk with Neil about it, he would see it as because I think it was Shazer is the last mention of where it talks about the borders near the Red Sea, and that would be much further northwest on the map. But then after that, it just says that they followed in a southeastern direction, and
okay.
there's references in the text that they might have been going into a more sort of arid climate. They talk about the fertility decreasing.
Hmm.
But something that Neil talked about with me that I thought was quite interesting was before they even found the Nehem map, because I think it was found in like the late 1970s, and before they found the altar. So before Nahom was even discussed, the what were their names? The Hiltons, I think it was the Hiltons, and Hugh Nibley. So Hugh Nibley in the 1950s, and I think the Hiltons in the 1970s had gone over to Arabia and were basically trying to map out a plausible route that Lehi and his family might have traveled. And they had followed the incense trail. And where they believed, Nahom might have been where they would have turned eastward is in like this Wadi Joff area, which the
Hmm.
Nahum tribe is, within the Wadi Joff area. And what Neil Rapley, argued to me that I thought was quite interesting was before they even found the Nehem map or the altars, that this was one of the reconstructed routes that some faithful scholars thought that Lehi and his family might have traveled. I think Dan also pointed out that some had also hypothesized a coastal route as well.
Okay.
But basically, the apologetic is if they followed, the incense trail, they came to a place which was called Nahom. They said Ishmael was buried there, and then they turned nearly eastwards, from that time forward. And they would say not that Nahom is exactly, that's the exact bullseye place where the trail turns eastward, but it's this general Wadi Joff area. I think I've got a slide on that. It's within the Wadi Joff area, so it's around where the incense trail would turn eastward, going towards the Dhofar region. In the Nehem tribal region, there would be burial ground, so it would be a suitable place for Ishmael to have been buried. And then the altar, which was found in Yemen, is of a Nehemite, and the altars date to the 6th, 7th century BC because they found the map of Nehem, I believe it was around 1978, and then they're like, oh, okay, it's got like the right consonants, and it seems to be in the right sort of general location in the Wadi Joff area. But then the question was, did this exist in Lehi's time? And then when the altars were found of the Nehemite, they then said this corroborates that this shows that the Nehem place and region existed in the time of Lehi. Now, I know you
Hmm.
did an episode, and I think this was a good clarification because even I had this misconception for years. Was I thought the temple where the altars were found was Nahom, and
I
that it was a
well, and
burial site.
I just pause and say I think that is absolutely the way most members who are aware of Nahom understand it. Like in the Bob Reynolds Inconvenient Faith documentary, one of the things I questioned Jim Bennett about is he literally says this is in exactly the right place with exactly the right letters, and it's like, if you're going to use that apologetic, that's a real overstatement, I think, of the strength of the case. Like I can see why it's a compelling parallel to people, but yeah, representing it that way, I think, is really overpromising
Yeah,
what we've got
and
here.
it's actually incorrect. And it was a couple of years ago. I think it was a video by what do you? Oh, sorry, I forgot her name from analyzing Mormonism.
Julia.
Julia, sorry. She did a video where she basically showed the discrepancy between the Nahum tribal region and the Baran temple where the altars were found. And then that caused me to then look up some articles and read some things from Neil. And then I was like, "Oh, okay, I was just misunderstanding the evidence." And I think the way a lot of apologists and believers had spoken about it, which, big mistake on us, was we would purport it as, oh no, the Baran temple, that's Nahom, and the altars there shows that this is where Nahom was and it's a burial site.
Hmm.
Whereas the way that scholars like Neil Rapley and others would use it is to say that the Nahum tribe is about 120 or so kilometers away. So really, the altars are just there to validate that the Nahum tribal region existed in the
Right.
time of Lehi, basically. And in my interview
And
with Neil, he showed me this map. So this is like the Wadi Jaf area. This is
mhm.
Nim. And he just showed some different trails that they possibly could have gone turning eastward from there. And and then you know about this, but there's the Dhofar region that if you follow sort of nearly eastward from the Nehem
Mhm.
tribal region, it leads you to the Dhofar region. I'll just read briefly what it says. Cor
Sure.
Carfat. So there's two candidates. There's Cor Roy, Cor Carfat. But the Dhofar region is described as being the most fertile coastal location on the Arabian Peninsula, with abundant fresh water, large trees, fruit, vegetation. Its natural resources satisfy Nephi's description of much fruit and wild honey, as well as the need for substantial timber to build a ship. I put a question mark there because I that was pushed back on by Dan Vogel. I talked about that with Neil, so that claim may not be correct. But also having like mountains and steep cliffs, and Nephi's brothers could have thrown him to the depths of the sea. Smeltable ore. So basically, they would say that if you go eastward from the Nehem tribal region, which is the only place on the incense trail you could have turned eastward because of the empty quarter, then that would lead to the Dhofar region, which has some plausible candidates matching a
Hmm.
lot of the criteria for Bountiful. Again, timber might be one which can be pushed back on. I talked about it with Neil, and he said there's a couple other possible candidates. Um, but basically, my sort of overall thoughts on this, and I'm happy for you to share yours. I
Hmm.
personally find the Incense Trail route, the plausible locations of the Valley of Lemuel, Nahom, and Bountiful, to be plausible candidates. Trying to read what I wrote. Um, I see it as they geographically correspond and converge quite well together, but I don't see any of it as definitive archaeological evidence, even though, Neil found the stela of the funeral stela, the gravestone of a guy called Ishmael, who seems to be a traveler. But again, there's no way we could prove that's the Ishmael. But in my mind, I sort of see the old world geography. I think it's quite probable. Like in my mind, I would probably see it more as like it's more probable than not. Like I'm probably more in that 50 to 70% range that to me, I would almost find it hard to believe it's all a coincidence unless Joseph had some sort of a map. Like if it was just Nahum, I would find it less compelling. But I do feel like if they did follow the incense trail, that would bring you to the Wadi Jaf area. The Nehem tribe is in the Wadi Jaf area. Then the trail would turn eastward. That would bring you to the Dhofar region, where there's some very plausible candidates for Bountiful. I personally find it quite plausible, but it's not definitive or absolute proof. Do you have any quick thoughts you want to share? I just had two questions I want to ask you after.
Oh, sure. Let me look at my notes on Nahum real quick.
That's fine.
Um, so yeah, we've covered the actual site. That Baran Temple is near Marib when you had that map up. So yeah,
Yes.
already separating it from the Baran Temple and from the shrines themselves, I think does do a lot to um, really reconcile with the evidence. I think one of the other things I guess I would just point out is if we're looking at the entire region, and then like this region, the Nehem region is like the same size as like Utah County for people who are familiar with the size of like the county where Provo and Orem lives. It's like, if I remember correctly, it's like between 1,500 and 2,000 square miles. So when I look at stuff like this and I have it purported to me as a hit, like that there are burial mounds in that region, not where the altars are. I kind of just think about it almost like, are you familiar with like Bayes' theorem, like comparing priors and calculating like hits in probabilities?
Not super familiar. I've heard
Okay.
about it.
The basic idea is like you've got to compare how likely something is based on your known priors. That's one of the things that goes into understanding Bayes' theorem. And I guess the way I look at it is like I can understand why there are compelling parallels, but I don't think a lot of apologists have done the analysis to look at like whether we're just seeing and counting the hits. And what I mean by that is like that stela is a great example. Like finding a stela with someone named Ishmael in this region where there were so many people named Ishmael should be entirely unsurprising. And I think when we see scholars making a big deal of one particular stela or the way that like the altars in Nehem at the Baran temple were represented, at least for a long time, the way I always heard them offered as an apologetic, I guess I just feel a little bit like it's Texas sharpshooter stuff going on. Like we have to compare all of the analysis. We have to look at all of the priors. We have to ask ourselves, how likely would it be to find someone named Ishmael in that region that's buried? Well, pretty likely, right? When we think about Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael as being so central to that region and to different religious groups in that region. So that's probably what I think. So, I can absolutely understand why you see it as compelling. Let me go back full screen so I can see your
Can
notes
I just give
here.
a quick comment on that? Because
Sure.
whenever I talked to Neil about this, because he was the one that did the
Hmm.
research on the Ishmael Stela, and I'll just concede, I don't see this. I think see it as interesting, but I don't see this as strengthening the case all that much. The Ishmael Stela. He did say in Jerusalem, Ishmael was a very common name. He said in this part of Arabia, it was less common. And according to what he said to me and his research, which I'm just going off, he said the way it was written was signifying that this was sort of a traveler and not a native to the region. So I think that's what he would say to that. But either way, I'm not going to really want to push back too hard on the Ishmael Stela. I understand what you mean about like this could be a coincidence, and that's why I'm not quite as far as some apologists who are like, this is a 100% bullseye because the Book of Mormon doesn't specify, for example, we traveled X amount of miles and then we
Exactly.
came to this region. So there is, like, I allow room that there could be some coincidences. I personally find the convergence turning eastward, which would lead to the
Hmm.
Dhofar region, is that makes it a little bit more compelling to me and a bit more plausible. But
Sure.
one question I wanted to ask you was,
Hmm.
if this was like a historical event, like let's just say this really is a historical text, like Lehi and his family really did travel through Arabia and go to Bountiful and build a ship and cross the Promised Land. Like realistically, what better evidence do you think we would find in the old world than what we do have? Because, for example, up until Nahum, they're just naming all these places. So I don't know what evidence we would find of that. And then the
Hmm.
one place they said, it was called Nahum, which I would read that as they're saying it probably already had a name. And then they're saying they turned eastward and then they give all this description of Bountiful and we find some plausible candidates. Like, other than finding like an inscription that says like, Nephi, the son of Lehi, was here. Like that would be awesome. That would be like, okay,
Right.
that would be a bullseye. Uh, but realistically, what would make this stronger if this really was historical travel?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really appreciate it because I think it shows from you an approach to really understand my point of view. I actually agree with you that I don't know we should find a whole lot of external evidence like that would historically help us find the Book of Mormon peoples or find the exact journey. I do think I haven't looked exactly at all of the parts where the text says how closely they are to the Red Sea, but one of the issues I have kind of with these maps is that I do feel like sometimes there is some cherry picking of how close they were or weren't to the sea. And I'll just admit that I would need to go through that again and re-examine whether I'm just assuming that. But when I put together my Nahum slides, my memory was that the last signal before they hit Nahum is that they were in the borders by the Red Sea. And it says that they're doing that to be in the most fertile parts of the wilderness. So to answer your question, I think what I would look for the most, like what better evidence I would expect in this part of the journey, is actually in the text itself. I would expect the text to reflect more of what that region would have looked like and to describe events in a way that I can understand them historically. And that was kind of going to be my one last thought before you ask me your question is when we get to the region, whether it's at Carfu or elsewhere in that Dhofar, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
Dhofar region. The story that takes place in Bountiful in the Book of Mormon is really difficult for me to believe from a historical perspective. It involves, a small group of people who knows exactly how many were in Nephi and Lehi's company, building a ship from scratch with any tools that they would have had to bring with them or build on the road or in that region. Those parts of the narrative make it really difficult for me to find the convergence compelling. Does that help explain my perspective? It's just like what comes later in the text, like I know what happens at Bountiful is so difficult to believe from a historical perspective for me that it's almost like these little convergences can't overcome, in my mind, this mountain of difficulty on the historicity side. Like the fact that one family who we have no record in at least in the text, no indication that they understand anything about shipbuilding, that they've had any dealing in shipbuilding. The fact that these people would build a ship, a transoceanic vessel in this day and age is very, very difficult for me to believe. So it's almost like the text itself is my answer to your question. Like the text would need to do more to look like a historical text.
No, I understand that point, and certainly when it comes to certain stories and aspects of the Book of Mormon, such as Nephi building a ship, some of those things are hard to defend from a apologetic or from an intellectual point of view. I think in the story he's divinely directed, so some certain things are just
Hmm.
miraculous. I think if I were to share my perspective on it, you know, some people have hypothesized the possibility that Joseph could have seen or had access to a map of Arabia. I'm not really convinced by that. I think I just find it quite improbable in my mind with the route that Lehi and his family traveled. And
Hmm.
as I said before, that the Hiltons, when they tried to reconstruct it, before they even found Nahom, they were going along the incense trail. It's like this could be a very plausible route they might have followed, where they believed that they would have turned eastward in this generic Wadi Joff area, a
Hmm.
place, with the three constants was there. Then the eastward turn would bring them to the Dhofar region where a lot of the criteria for Nephi's bountiful, would fit that criteria. I think I almost find it hard to believe that all of those things would fit together or that it's all just a coincidence. And I understand you might see it as apologists are maybe just trying to make it fit to make it a bullseye. But I personally think it corresponds quite well. And the last point I was going to make was, because when it comes to the Book of Mormon, if the Book of Mormon is historical, there's a lot of implications. It means Joseph was a prophet. It means that
Hmm.
an angel came with gold plates. It means the supernatural is real. Jesus is the Christ. Whereas if I were to look at First Nephi and just look at it as like an apocryphal text, so say it's historicity just doesn't matter. It doesn't prove any spiritual or supernatural claims. And if archaeologists were looking at it and say this was non-LDS archaeologists who were reconstructing, like, oh yeah, this could be a plausible location for the Valley of Lemuel, Wadi Taib Ali Sim. And I was like, oh, they might have followed the incense trail and Nehem sort of in the right general region. Then if they followed nearly eastward, that'll bring them to the Dhofar region. My question is, would there be the same dismissal or skepticism? And I feel like I hope my view would be consistent that I would say like, yeah, it's not 100%, like it's not, beyond a reasonable doubt, but I see it as more probable than not in my mind. But I can understand someone not being as compelled by it, but that would sort of be my view. Like, would you feel the same way, even if this was an apocryphal text and the historicity and the geography doesn't matter?
Yeah, I would, or at least I hope I would be intellectually consistent there and be just as skeptical because I'm not necessarily saying I don't see what you see. Like,
Mhm.
I guess there's part of me that's just like I'm not really understanding the significance of the convergence point, and I'm happy to have you explain a little bit more to me because I guess when I brought up like Bayes' theorem, I guess what I'm saying is we have to like look at two alternative hypotheses. And I guess, referencing the people before Nahum was found, the Hiltons that you've referenced a few times, I
Yeah.
guess I'm just struggling to go like, what other possible route would they have come up with? That like it really isn't as how do I say this? It really isn't as complex, I guess, to me, or that impressive that like they just kind because the Book of Mormon is so nondescript generally about where they're going. Like it's just talking mostly in general direction. Like you said, there are very few times when it says like they traveled this direction for this amount of days. I think it's really just that one journey right at the beginning, if I remember correctly. So I guess that's where I just look at like the significance of the hit, and I feel like I would be consistently skeptical and probably be like, yeah, I guess I can see an interesting convergence here. I'm just not sure that the convergence alone is compelling enough for me to believe that it's historical. Um, does that answer your question? And then I wanted to
Yeah.
say one thing about the map real quick.
Oh, that's okay. I'll just make my one final point. I guess I would say that I don't believe Joseph would have known about, for example, the ancient incense trail, for example. And, the theory or hypothesis is if they had followed it, and in the
Hmm.
text they turned nearly eastward from Nahum, and they're saying that nowhere else before the Wadi Joff region, so basically Nahum is within the Wadi Joff region, nowhere before that could they have turned eastward. It's only in this region, in the Wadi Joff region, could the eastward turn have happened? And then following nearly eastward would bring you to the Dhofar region that is sort of the only place on the Arabian coast that would meet a lot of the criteria, if that makes sense. So if for example, they said that they came to Nahum and then they turned southward from that point, and we didn't find somewhere that had the criteria for Bountiful, then I think, oh, okay, that wouldn't converge as well. But it's the fact that going eastward from the Nahum region would bring you to the Dhofar region, which would meet the criteria. And that's why I think that sort of reinforces the strength of the Nahum argument, if that makes sense.
It does. I think my difficulty with it is that there are a lot of if conditionals that you have to accept to get to that convergence in the first place, right? You have to accept that they were traveling along that incense trail. You have to accept the significance of the Nehem region as being associated with Nahom. And then, so I can see it if you're willing to buy all the pieces in that conditional. But because there are so many conditionals, that's where it's like, well, if we look really carefully at the text, I'm not sure how many of those conditionals are actually met by the text. And that just is then when it comes back to how people look at the text. I
And
did
I'll
want to
grant with
say,
you, if the text said that, and we turned like 100 miles inland, and then it said, like, I don't know the exact distance in miles, but say it's like 1,000 miles to Nahum. If they said we traveled 1,000 miles or X amount of days, and then people would reconstruct and be like, "Oh, that would bring you exactly to there." That would definitely
mhm.
make it a lot stronger. So I can understand you saying that the text isn't super specific about the days traveled from Shazer until they get to Nahum.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'm not expecting the text to like give us an exact like every step that they took to be clear. It's just like when we're looking at it from the question of historicity, that's where it's just like I would my understanding from some of the videos that Dan has done about Bountiful in particular is like that entire coastline is basically filled with other places that could be viewed as potential hits. So that's kind of why my mind immediately, when we talk about Nahom and Bountiful, goes to like this idea of Bayes' theorem is just like we have to compare the different possibilities and then look at it like probabilistically. And I can understand why you see it as a compelling convergence. Sure. I think the one thing I want to say about the map, because you brought up the possibility
Ah,
of
yes.
Joseph maybe having a map of Arabia. This is actually something I had gotten some pushback on the episode we had done on LDS discussions on Nahom. And I guess I kind of want to clear that up. I don't believe that Joseph Smith actually accessed any of those maps. I think the significance of those maps to me is like the significance of when people point to texts like whether it's First Book of Napoleon or Late War or View of the Hebrews is not that Joseph Smith was directly borrowing from any of these things. It just helps us understand what Joseph Smith in theory had available to him because I think there's a lot of times where apologists or members might think the only way Joseph Smith could have known about the Nahum region, for example, is through divine revelation. And whether Joseph Smith had access to the map or not, we just know that that isn't true. Like there were people in Joseph Smith's day and age who did have access to these maps and could have seen them. So to clear it up, I don't think Joseph Smith actually saw one of those maps. I think that when we're looking at naturalistic theories, like I'll just be real open about the fact that, like, as a skeptic, I'm going to think that a naturalistic theory of Book of Mormon origins, even one that I don't necessarily believe in, like Joseph Smith accessing a map of Arabia, is more likely than the supernatural events. But that really comes back to just kind of, our difference on the faith versus
Worldview
not
and
faith, God
right.
versus not God question. And so I have no problem just admitting that up front, that like I don't think Joseph Smith actually saw a map. I think the other thing that's interesting about that though is that Joseph Smith, I think this is where like the idea of meme theory and understanding how ideas get passed from person to person is another thing that's important to think about in Joseph Smith's day and age. Um, in the sense that Joseph Smith may have heard about the Nahum region. I'm just saying it's possible that Joseph Smith heard about the Nahum region without ever having seen one of those maps. Where I actually think the name Nahum comes from in the Book of Mormon, like if I had to explain where I think it comes from, is simply just Joseph Smith looking at names in the Bible
Mm.
and using similar names to names in the Bible. That's where I think it comes from personally, not that he actually saw a map.
And if I were to go with the naturalistic theory, I have to say I would probably find it more believable that it's all a coincidence versus like the map theory as well.
Yeah,
But yeah, that's my first evidence. Like I said before,
cool.
in my mind, I find it plausible, probable. It's not 100% bullseye proof, and who knows? Maybe we'll find an inscription that says Nephi, son of Lehi, was here, and be like, right, okay, how do you explain that?
That would be super impressive.
That'd be cool.
Okay, my first point then was textual anachronisms. So I'm actually, in my examples, I kind of have a big bucket of things, but I'm only going to really talk about one. So when I talk about textual anachronisms, we could talk about the long ending of Mark being present in the Book of Mormon. I guess from now that I better understand like your view of where the Book of Mormon comes from, that's probably easily explicable in your theory because it's Joseph Smith doing that interpretation akin to DNC 9. And so that's probably how you would explain textual anachronisms in the text. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think like specifically with the long ending of Mark or even like New Testament passages, I did a video on the long ending of Mark. Even though scholars say it wasn't in like the earliest manuscripts they have of Mark, there was some Christian documents and Christian sources which attested that Jesus likely gave some sort of like commission like that to his
Sure.
disciples. So, probably a faithful theory would be that even if it wasn't in the earliest manuscripts of Mark, Jesus still could have given a similar commission to his disciples and that he could have done it in the New World. But I would see it as a lot of the passages that we see, which are like New Testament or even just King James Bible phrases, is there might have been something similar meaning on the plates, but the translation is utilizing the King James Bible vernacular. So I don't think it would have been exactly the same as the King James Bible English,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
On the original plates is what you
On
mean.
the original, yes, but something
Okay.
very similar.
But that there was something similar, and then Joseph Smith doing the interpretation basically uses the King James Bible language to capture the same sentiment, basically.
Yeah,
Okay.
for the most part,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, and that makes sense. So maybe this textual anachronism point that I have will kind of just be obviated by the way you see the Book of Mormon. But the one that I have is about the Book of Mormon's Isaiah passages. So I have done a presentation on this before. Here's basically the high level conclusion is that, as people know, the Book of Mormon has a lot of Isaiah passages that are quoted directly in it. The idea in the text, at least, is that these quotations are being taken from the brass plates. So, people who are familiar with the story of the Book of Mormon, right? The brothers and the family leave Jerusalem, they go back to obtain the brass plates, which the text is very specific about what scriptures or like proto scriptures are and are not on the brass plates. So It seems to stand to reason to me that these Isaiah passages are being copied, at least as Nephi says, from those brass plates. Now, the problem for that, when we look at like textual anachronisms, in my mind, is that the Book of Mormon's Isaiah passages almost always, I'm sorry, align word for word with the King James Version or the Masoretic text tradition, including late medieval editions, translation quirks, and even Latin loanwords, while they show no substantive agreement with any unique reading from the Great Isaiah Scroll. So, for people who aren't familiar with what the Great Isaiah Scroll is or what the significance of it is, the Great Isaiah Scroll is a scroll that was found in Qumran, and it is the oldest, most complete version. It's an entire complete version of the book of Isaiah that backed our understanding of earlier versions of Isaiah up by 1,000 years earlier. So we had manuscripts of Isaiah, and then we found the Great Isaiah Scroll, which basically preserves 1,000 year earlier version of Isaiah. So, what this demonstrates, at least to me, is that the Book of Mormon reflects the 17th century English Bible, not a pre exilic Hebrew source, contradicting the text's claim to preserve Isaiah as it existed around 600 BC. Now, again, this criticism might not apply to your theory of the Book of Mormon as I understand it, but I'll still offer it anyways.
Sure.
This timeline just kind of breaks down kind of the issue I just talked about, right? So 740 BC is when we have Isaiah's ministry begin. 600 BC or around 600 BC is when we have Lehi and Nephi leave Jerusalem with the brass plates. In 125 BC is when the Great Isaiah Scroll is actually created and written. Like I said, about 1,000 years later is when we have the Leningrad Codex, which is a version of the Masoretic text tradition that preserves Isaiah. That's one of the texts that's then used to go into the 1611 King James Version. What we would expect, I think, when we're looking at it as a historical question, again, kind of outside the realm of faith, is we would expect the brass plates version of Isaiah to be better captured by the Great Isaiah Scroll than we would by a version 1,000 year earlier or 1,000 year later version of Isaiah, just as a consequence of the way that time and the transmission of information through text worked. Now there was a piece written in 1981 by, I think the research was originally done by John Tvetnes. Yeah, that's
Oh
right.
yes, I've read this.
Um, yeah, this piece basically looks at the Great Isaiah Scroll in the Book of Mormon, and they offer five, quote unquote hits where the Great Isaiah Scroll and the Book of Mormon's versions of Isaiah line up. One of them is the addition of an and. One of them is the use of a plural verb versus a non-plural verb. One of them is the use of I and my. One of them is making a plural noun. And this fourth example, which I have over here, at least as far as I can see it, looks like it was just different translations of the original Great Isaiah Scroll. It doesn't seem to be a hit to me at all. One thing that's interesting about that particular hit too, their fish stink for lack of water and die of thirst, is that you kind of see this mashup of these two different ideas also in the Adam Clark's Bible commentary. I don't necessarily believe all of the theories about Joseph Smith using the Adams Clark's Bible commentary specifically for the Book of Mormon, but Kolby Townsend, the far better Kolby than I, has done research on that if people are interested
Non-rando.
in, non-rando
Mhm.
on the internet. So this is just an example of one of the things that I was talking about. So Second Nephi chapter 12 is a capturing of Isaiah chapter 2. And this to me is a really incredible piece of evidence for the hypothesis of historicity, because if you look on the left-hand side of your screen here, I've got the Great Isaiah Scroll translation version. So what you can see, and then on the right hand, I've got the Masoretic text version that will, better reflect what's in the King James version. And then I've got the Book of Mormon up here as well. So what you can see is that in the original version of Isaiah, or at least an earlier version of Isaiah, in the Great Isaiah Scroll version, you do not have verse 10 and you do not have the back half of verse 9. So you see that difference between the two up here at the top? Verse 9, the
Yes, so
Masoretic text
oh, do
version
not forgive
adds
them.
exactly. And then it adds verse 10, go deep into the rock, bury yourselves in the ground before the terror of the Lord and his dread majesty. So, in my mind, what we should expect to see is the Book of Mormon not capture the back half of verse 9 and not capture verse 10. again, if we're looking at it like Nephi is inscribing what's on the brass plates version, I would at least expect it to better reflect what's in the Great Isaiah Scroll version than I would this version from 1,000 years after. And unfortunately, that's just not what we see. Instead, we see the Book of Mormon follow with the Masoretic text version. And the wording is slightly changed, which in my mind actually kind of makes it worse, because that means Joseph Smith is like negotiating or interpreting the text, and we don't see it reflect like this earliest version of Isaiah.
After a quick pushback, because I actually looked that one up,
Sure.
because I actually thought it was a good point, and you might have more examples than this, so this is just one you picked. But I wanted to
Hmm.
look it up, and this is just from a quick Google search. It says the famous Great Isaiah Scroll does indeed omit the second half of verse 9 and the
Hmm.
entirety of verse 10. That's what you said, wasn't it?
Right.
Right. Um, they say scholars generally believe this was a scribal error or that these verses were a later addition to that specific textual tradition. But crucially, there were other Isaiah scrolls found at Qumran, other Isaiah fragments, and also the
Correct.
Septuagint translation, which they say contain those verses in it. So I think what I've read online is saying that this might just be an omission in the long Isaiah scroll, if I'm understanding correctly. So they're basically saying that these other Isaiah fragments actually contain verse 9 and the Septuagint version, so that this might just be a scribal error, not including that part.
It might be. I think because we would have to look at the dates of those manuscripts, and I don't know off the top of my head which manuscripts that they're likely referencing there. But in my mind, that actually makes the problem worse because if we have that in later text traditions and not in this earliest text tradition, that to me is very clear evidence that it is a later scribal edition. And by it, I mean the back half of verse 9 and all of verse 10 is a later scribal edition because again, the significance of this great Isaiah scroll is it's from 1,000 years earlier than any of the manuscripts that were found before that. So the significance to me of that is we should expect the brass plates version to reflect the great Isaiah scroll version. So I guess I would have to look at those exact manuscripts
Well,
fragments that you're
I'll
talking
just
about.
share briefly. I'm not an expert in any of this, but my very quick response to that would be if I believe the Septuagint version does date before the Dead Sea Scroll version, is my understanding. I don't know about the other fragments they're saying, but they're saying if the second half of verse 9 also and verse is it second half of verse 9 and verse 10, if that was in
Correct.
the earlier Septuagint version, so prior to the Great Isaiah Scroll, and some of these other fragments had it, then they're saying, oh, when it comes to the specific Great Isaiah Scroll, it somehow must have got omitted, but it was preserved in these earlier scrolls of Isaiah and in the Septuagint
Sure.
version. So they would say that it's not problematic that the Book of Mormon includes those because they actually might have been in an earlier version. But that's just one
Sure.
specific
And it's
example.
And I think anytime that we look at manuscripts, yeah, just to be transparent about it, anytime we look at manuscripts, there's different ways to interpret it, right? There's always the question of which was the original version. My understanding is the significance of that piece of evidence in particular is that the Great Isaiah Scroll is the early, at least this is the way I understand it, but maybe I'm wrong. The Great Isaiah Scroll is the earliest version, and that's why it's surprising to me that it's not in there, but is in later manuscripts, at least based on my understanding that would seem to indicate to me that it's a later scribal addition. But I'll move on to some more
That's fine.
specific
Yeah.
or some different examples. So here's one where, the King James Version and the Book of Mormon version use the name Lucifer. Again, with your interpretive model of the Book of Mormon, probably not a big issue, but both the Masoretic text tradition and then the Great Isaiah Scroll version don't use that term because the term Lucifer would not have existed in 600 BC, at least not in use in this region, because that's a later language development. It instead just uses O'Day Star, son of the morning. Um, this one to me is probably the most interesting example I think I have. So this is in First Nephi chapter 20. That doesn't make sense. It's probably supposed to be Second Nephi chapter 20, chapter 48, where the great Isaiah scroll records, "Hear this, house of Jacob, who are called by the name of Israel and have come forth from the loins of Judah, who swear by the name of the Lord and invoke the God of Israel, but not in truth nor in righteousness." The Masoretic text version, again, which is a later, a later manuscript or a later text tradition, uses, instead of loins of Judah, uses fountains of Judah. So you can kind of understand how, because translation is an art, not a science, right? You can understand how someone could translate or could see loins and fountain as just like euphemistic language, right? We're going to change loin to fountain. One of the things that's interesting to me about this particular example is then when we're in the King James version, we get waters of Judah. And then when we get, I just need to move this little dashboard, sorry. Then when we get to the Book of Mormon's version, we actually get out of the waters of Judah or out of the waters of baptism. The issue, in my mind, being that baptism is not really a thing that exists in the Jewish tradition in 600 BC. And again, I'm not an expert on the history of the Jewish religion, but this one is interesting to me in the sense that if Joseph Smith is negotiating with this text, if he's doing this interpretive model, you can see where loins of Judah becomes fountain of Judah becomes waters of Judah then becomes waters of Judah or out of the waters of baptism. To me, this just kind of shows like the Book of Mormon is not capturing this earliest text tradition like the text seems to indicate that it is. Instead, it is more, this is actually really strong evidence for your hypothesis of how the Book of Mormon is translated, actually, Murph, I would say,
Hmm.
because you can see Joseph Smith negotiating with this text.
Yeah, and just a brief comment on that. I
Mhm.
believe that was an editorial insertion by Joseph Smith in, I think, the 1837 version of, oh, sorry, can you go back to the previous slide?
I The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. We'll see if I
Oh,
can.
oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. It was,
That's okay. There
it
we go.
says Waters of Judah. I believe it said Waters of Judah in the 1830 edition. And my understanding is that or out of the waters of baptism was a later editorial insertion by Joseph Smith. So I don't believe it was in the original
In
manuscript,
the
but he
original.
yeah. And I would agree with you. Like, I know ancient Israelites practiced sort of a ritual immersion for water
Right.
purification called the mikveh, but it was different from Christian baptism. So the physical act of immersion was a standard part of Jewish law. But baptism doesn't seem like it was practiced the same as it was in Christianity. Obviously, in the Book of Mormon, the belief would be that it was somehow revealed to the prophets, like in 2 Nephi 31, for example. But I would see or out of the waters of baptism is an editorial sort of insertion by Joseph sort of after the fact.
hmm So I can just stop with that example. I think that gives a good kind of overview of what I see. And I guess
Oh,
what I'm saying is I look at expected evidence, and it's like the text makes these claims that they're using and capture. Well, one of the issues is that the story of the brass plates really is a huge anachronism in a number of different ways. Like if you listen to academic scholars of the Bible and the creation of the Bible, the very story of the brass plates, like that they had collected a proto Bible from Genesis down to I think it's Jeremiah is what it says that it goes down to. I just don't think we've ever found any type of codex like that that reflects like a proto Bible being collected. And then when you combine it with looking at specific examples where it's like the text, and again, how people want to see those manuscripts on that one specific example, the text doesn't seem to reflect what we would expect if we look at that timeline again, where we've got an earlier version of Isaiah. The text of the Book of Mormon, in every substantive way that I looked at, seems to line up with the King James Bible or the Masoretic text tradition, not with what the Great Isaiah Scroll does. Again, excepting those few examples that I gave, the addition of an and, a plural noun, changing an I to a my, which to me just look like just what
not very
happens in
significant.
normal, like yeah, just what happens in normal translation stuff. And um I did omit non-hits that were of the same caliber, so I tried to play very intellectually consistent there. But to me, the significance of this is just like the text makes these claims that it's supposed to be capturing this earlier version of Isaiah. One, I don't know and this is like before we even get to like Deuto and Trito Isaiah. I just don't know that that's what we see reflected in the text itself. I think your model of the Book of Mormon probably makes this problem not really a problem because it just deals with Joseph Smith actually doing this interpretive model. But for people who do have that view, the ancient record itself was capturing this version of Isaiah, and it's so important because one of the purported missions of the Book of Mormon is to capture those lost, plain, and precious things. I just don't see that. I just don't think that that's what we see reflected in the evidence in the text itself.
No, I understand. And I think where I would agree with you, because whenever I was looking through it, I think other than like five of the hits, and the Septuagint one was kind of interesting to me, but it seems that for the majority of the Isaiah passages in the Book of Mormon, it's following the King James version as like the base text. Now I looked at of the 433 Isaiah passages which are quoted, there's some sort of a modification in about 50% of them. So there's some sort
Hmm.
of modifying going on. I'll talk about that in a wee sec. But yeah, whenever I looked into this, it seems that the majority of the changes which are being done are mostly to the italics. In the Book of Mormon, I think about 30% of the italics are being modified.
Hmm.
One, faithful position is that even some translators of, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, some people could translate them into the King James version, and then they would differ where the Dead Sea Scrolls substantially differed. So I think
Hmm.
it's undisputable that whatever was on the brass plates, if you believe it was a brass plates, that the translation Joseph is utilizing the King James Bible to express it. Now, I remember last
Hmm.
time you asked me a question, I wasn't very satisfied with my answer because you asked me about like, well, what about the differences? Because it's not always quoting exactly word for word. Some verses there might be, an extra phrase or something like that, or like what about one or two words? So I actually read an interesting article. It was a master's thesis
Hmm.
by what was her name? I've been looking at like a few different theories when it comes to like, you know, Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. So for example, someone like Brent Gardner, he would see it as come on. Can you see that?
Hmm.
Okay, so she did a master's thesis on Isaiah passages in the Book of Mormon. And so she sort of talked about that over 50% of the Isaiah passages in the Book of Mormon have some sort of variant. 119 of these are related to italicized words. So it seems like a lot of the changes are italicized words. Brent Gardner would take the view that Joseph is pretty much using the King James Bible as the functional translation, but he's
Hmm.
interacting with or engaging with the italics. Whenever I talked about this with Neil Rapley, Neil sees it as because the italics are the words which translators have added into it.
Hmm.
So they weren't on like the original Hebrew. He said that that might be the place where we might expect the most interaction or flexibility if Joseph is the translator or if you believe the Lord's the
Let
translator.
me
Mm,
let me ask you a question about that though. Why?
sure.
If Joseph isn't attached to the text, if he's doing interpretation, why? Like,
Like
why would we
if the Lord,
expect to see the most? What's that?
if the Lord or Joseph
Well,
or either.
I guess
Or
either.
like why
Yeah.
would he modify the words? Is that what you mean? Like if
Well,
he's
no. Why are we expecting to see the modification most in the italicized words? Because that's what's been added by the translators.
hmm. Yeah, and I think it would be that so he's basically using the King James sort of vernacular as the base text, but that the italics that are used by the translators are maybe more flexible. Like the rest of the translation, for example, would be like, yeah, this is on the Hebrew, but the italicized words would be like the words they've added in just to make it more readable, and there might be more flexibility in the specific word that you might use. So, for example, because I remember you asked me
But
last
th
time. Oh,
but
sorry,
there's
go ahead.
not only, well, I was just going to say, but there's not only changes made to the italics. So I guess I'm
Yeah, you're right.
struggling to understand why, like, if God is the one who's telling Joseph how to make the changes, why is it limited? Or I guess I'm just not understanding that position that Neil has. Like, if Joseph felt great, I can understand why Joseph might have felt greater latitude to change the italics, but that's almost more from a naturalistic side. I'm
Sure.
not understanding why, if God is the one communicating with Joseph what needs to be in the end product of the Book of Mormon, why it matters. The italicized. Maybe I'm not asking my question very clearly. That's basically what I'm asking. Why?
No, and
Why?
I think you're correct that we don't only see the changes with the italics. Predominantly, the italics seems to be where we see the most changes, but it's not only the italics. And I think his point of view would be that the italics would be the words which are inserted by the translator. So different translators would translate it very similarly, but the italics could vary a little bit per translation. So, for example, even if Joseph is using the King James Version as like the base text, the italics,
Hmm.
there could be more flexibility. So, for example, I went through her article because remember you asked me like,
Hmm.
oh, what about like one or two words that changes?
Hmm.
So she had like two examples. One was Isaiah 2:2. So in the Masoretic text, it says that in the Septuagint, it says the mountain of the Lord. And Qumran, it says that and then the Book of Mormon says when the. And
Hmm.
I don't know in that case if I would really believe that the Book of Mormon plate said when and that's why Joseph used when versus that. I almost see that like either could have worked, and this could have been Joseph, like even if he's adopting the King James Version language, that he was also free to modify it as well as a translator. So if it was like a specific word, I don't know if that's necessarily a reflection of the plate text being different. But for example, with the next one, it has in the Book of Mormon, it's very similar, O house of Jacob, come ye, let us walk in the light of the Lord. It's near enough similar in all the other versions. But then
Hmm.
the Book of Mormon
Hmm.
adds, yea, come, for ye have all gone astray, everyone to his wicked ways. And I would probably see that as because that is like, an added sentence. I would see that probably more coming from maybe there's something on the brass plates that said that. So I don't know if I would believe that one slightly different word between the King James Version and the Book of Mormon passage would be because of the plate text to clarify my position. So I think I would see it as Joseph had almost the license or the freedom to utilize the King James Version, but at times he could modify it. And sometimes it could have been because of the plate text, sometimes not. Like, so for example, like, I don't know, say I was
But
translating a text.
can I pause you for 1 second?
Yeah,
In
sure.
this particular example, though, right? So Qumran is like the Dead Sea Scrolls, which would include. So when they say Qumran, they're probably looking at um, not just the Great Isaiah Scroll, but other scrolls that were found at Qumran. And this particular example is interesting to me because I think it kind of gets back to the way I see this.
Mm.
So Qumran does not have that additional phrase that you were suggesting, I think may have been on the brass plates text because it's not one word. You're differentiating between the one word and maybe like an entire
Yes.
passage. And I
Yes.
guess I'm saying, I guess this might help me get my concluding thought on this point out, which is
Okay.
imagine how impressive it would be if in the Qumran passage, but not in the Septuagint or in the Masoretic text version, we had yea, come for all, or something that could be rendered as yea, come for all have gone astray, everyone to his wicked ways. And that was in the Great Isaiah Scroll or these scrolls that are found at Qumran. We could understand how, oh, look at how significant of a hit that is, because what Joseph is basically claiming something should have been on the brass plates is also found in this earlier text tradition that is absent from the Masoretic text and from the Septuagint. Do you understand, I guess, the way I'm seeing it, which is like we should expect to see some of that. And I don't think we really ever see that in a significant way aside from those four examples that I gave. And I think it's the expected evidence would be so significant. And there are examples where the two differ. And I think it's just like I'm just overwhelmed by the fact that we don't see the evidence that we would expect to see.
No, I understand that. That would be really cool if we had that from Qumran. And I tend to agree, like most of the words that we do see that do align with the Dead Sea Scrolls is really just a word or two here or there.
Right.
So I don't find it strong evidence. I think I'm just articulating when you asked me last time,
Yeah, yeah,
do
yeah.
I
I
see
understand. Yep.
do I see some of the differences because over 50% of the Isaiah passages in the Book of Mormon differ or modified in some way.
Right.
I'm clarifying that I think if there's like an additional sentence or something like that, if it's significant, that might be more of a reflection of the plate text versus if it's
I
just one
gotcha.
word. I would probably see that more as Joseph as the translator who it's clear that he's utilizing sort of King James version translation,
Hmm.
but he also has the prophetic, I guess, freedom to like he doesn't have to quote it exactly word for word. So like for example, like if I was translating a text and it said like God's plan is for all his children to have eternal life, I could do like a translation that's like God's work of glory is to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life
Right.
of all his children. And obviously I'm quoting Moses 139, but I've also changed, man to children, and that could be because of the underlying plate text, but sort of captures the meaning. That's sort of what I mean. Um,
I gotcha.
and the last thing I'll just say is whenever I've been looking up the Isaiah portions, some scholars have pointed to, one that the brass plates come from like the northern kingdom, for example. So even though we might expect it to look a lot more similar to the Dead Sea Scroll version, there might even be some differences between the brass plates and the Dead Sea Scrolls. But even with those differences, you make a fair point that the Book of Mormon does seem to be adopting the King James as the translation anyway. Some scholars have pointed to in the original manuscript that the structure or the chapters of Isaiah are different to the King James version. I don't know if you've looked into this, but for example, like say if it was like chapters 11 to 16, which would be like six different chapters in the Book of Mormon,
Hmm.
show up in the original manuscript as like one long chapter. So people like Brian Gardner pointed to that he would see that maybe there was a different structure on the original plate text, but the language or the translation was being rendered primarily through sort of the King James version, but there might have been a different structure that the Nephite authors had on. I don't think it's a super significant point, but I thought it was interesting whenever I heard about that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I understand. And I think this particular point, I do think it's an interesting analysis to do for the question of historicity because it is such a historically rooted claim, like the brass plates and then how to deal with the brass plates. But yeah, I tend to agree with you that like that first example, like the one word, two word differences, those aren't really the ones that are compelling to me. I did look at every single difference. And I didn't look at the entire Qumran collection. I just looked at the Great Isaiah Scroll because my understanding is that it was the earliest. And you're right that, and I've tried to be very careful when I talk about this to not say I'm expecting it to be an exact match because I just don't think that's the way that textual transmission um, is reflected in reality. But I do think it should be a better match than the King James version. And
I see.
so I just wanted to clarify that it's like
No, I think that's
I
a
don't think we
fair
see really any substantive alignment. Yeah,
I think that's a
and
fair and
that's
valid
where I was.
criticism. And I would like to bring on a scholar who knows a lot more about this than myself, but I think it's a fair criticism that you brought up. And I think like if I'm in my sort of theory of Book of Mormon
Mhm.
translation, if it is a translation, I would see both modern and ancient elements, and I wouldn't point to the words of the Isaiah passages as being an ancient element. It seems like this would, if it's a translation, this would be more of a
Mhm.
modern feature. I don't think it's a good apologetic to point to the five examples that align with the Dead Sea Scrolls version when the vast majority of it doesn't seem to, if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
I also think it's great ammo for your theory of Book of Mormon translation, which is that, that through Joseph, that he's interpreting
Right.
some original core, actually. I think this is actually a very strong reason that people should entertain that theory of Book of Mormon translation, because if you view it as just a strict, tight, literal
Literal.
translation of what was
Yes.
on those plates, I think this argument is, at least in my mind, a pretty strong defeater for that view of the what was on the plates, then making it into the Book of Mormon. So it actually kind of helps you in a way, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I would actually agree with you there. I would agree with you. Right, I'll jump on to my
Cool.
second one.
Let's do it.
Okay, hold on.
I
Okay.
really I'll
Oh,
just pause and make one meta comment for a
yeah,
second,
go
which
for it.
is I'm really happy how well we're able to navigate a conversation like this. And I hope people appreciate how well we're trying to model, respectful disagreement here because
Yeah,
I really appreciate how respectful and just how well this conversation is going. Anyways,
yeah, me too.
continue.
Yeah, me too. And I don't think there's any need, even though these are passionate subjects, that there's a need for it to get heated or contentious.
Mhm.
And I think it's what I think's good about us talking to each other is you can concede. We're like, oh, I can see your point of view, or I can understand why you might find that compelling. And then I
Mhm.
might refine a position, being like, yeah, I maybe don't think this is as strong as apologetic argument. So I think that's why it's valuable to have these discussions, because in our echo chambers, we might make arguments that people on our team probably wouldn't challenge, but you'd be more
Mhm.
likely to push back against me, and vice versa. So the next one,
Yeah, and just to your point, I've used those exact slides a number of times. No one on my side has pointed out to me that that out of the waters of baptism was a later addition, and I looked it up while you were talking. You're absolutely right, it was. So
Mhm.
it can also help. I guess that's the other value for people who are like, why talk with people who disagree with you? Because steel sharpens steel. And I don't want to give people incorrect information. So
Absolutely.
I'm going to adapt my argument accordingly and note that caveat in the future. So, people learn from each other through conversations like this.
No, absolutely. That's how I feel as well. So the next one, I feel bad because I sort of lumped a couple together, but ancient names
That's
and
okay.
Hebrew literary elements. So I'll try to go through this kind of quick. So, you know, a lot of like critical historians would point to like King Benjamin's speech and sermon being similar to like a revivalist preacher preaching to the people. They all have this born again experience and are converted to Christ. And whenever I came back to the church, Blake also talks about in one of his articles that there's actually a lot of connections to an ancient covenant renewal festival, or specifically the Feast of Tabernacles. So he just says that not all of Mosiah 1 to 6 can be explained as a 19th century camp meeting and conversion experience. No 19th century camp meeting was convened by royal proclamation, requiring the attendance of the entire nation to be present at the temple where the king would consecrate his successor. So there's going to be a coronation of his son Mosiah. And they would often go to the temple for it. And they brought, firstlings of the flocks to offer sacrifices. And Jack Welch, he's written an article on the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, which is a ancient Israelite feast and festival celebrating the Exodus from Egypt. So he talks about parallels between Sukkot and King Benjamin's speech, um, things like a pilgrimage to the temple, sitting in tents, reading the law, coronating a king, renewing the covenant. And I'll just say, like, I don't find this like really, really strong evidence, and I could understand someone viewing this and saying that, I still think you could explain a lot of this through a camp meeting, 19th century context or milieu. But I do think some things do fit with the ancient context, like going to the temple, remaining in their tents, similar to with Sukkot, they would be in booths, doing sacrifices, the Day of Atonement, renewing the covenant between Yahweh and his people. It would be a time where there would be a lot of coronation. So there's certain aspects of it that I think, oh, that actually does fit with the ancient feast of tabernacles. And if the Nephites had Christianity, which I guess would be a big concession from you, then you could allow for, oh, this would sort of fit. Whereas when it comes to the camp meeting theory, you would just have to say that Joseph Smith, with his imagination, added these other elements. But I find it interesting that it connects with this ancient Israelite festival. Any quick thoughts on that? I don't want to spend too long on this point.
Well, yeah, I mean, my biggest thought on this is because I've heard about parallels both to this and then other, ancient Hebrew, either rituals or like rites. My big thought on these hits is the text of the Book of Mormon doesn't really like, how do I say this? In the Gospels, there are specific reasons that things are done on certain time frames because of the Sabbath. Like the burial of Jesus, for example, it specifically references them needing to get the body prepped because the Sabbath was approaching, right? And the Passover and things like that. My thought is hits like these are just not very compelling parallels to me when the text of the Book of Mormon doesn't do a whole lot else to reflect the Hebrew traditions and rituals of that day. They're always like implicit parallels that apologists seem to, in my view at least, read into the text. And I might see them as a lot more compelling if we had some recognition of the text of some of the Jewish laws during that time period reflected in the text of the Book of Mormon. Does that make sense? It's like I guess I'm just not able to see them as compelling hits when there's so many like basic things that we should expect to see reflected in the Book of Mormon that we don't see reflected in the Book of Mormon when it comes to ancient Judaism. So it's like
Okay.
it seems very implicit to find something like this, but not see stuff about the food codes reflected, nothing about the raiment codes reflected. That's I guess the way I see these hits.
I understand. There's a few things that I see that sort of fit within sort of the ancient Jewish or Israelite context in the Book of Mormon. Like, so for example, I believe Lehi offers sacrifices 3 days after he leaves Jerusalem. After 3 days travel,
Hmm.
then they offer sacrifices. And I believe there's a text, I think from Qumran, where they say that was almost like a Jewish law that you had to be 3 days from Jerusalem before you could offer sacrifices. And I know, I think it's in like the small plates portion, either with Enos or Jacob, or where
Hmm.
they're talking about the Lamanites and they're talking about them like eating, beasts of prey and like drinking their blood and they would shave their heads. And it doesn't
Hmm.
implicitly say it, but those things would have been against the law of Moses or like Levitical law. And then, for example, like you don't hear about like the Nephites eating pigs or having swine, because that would have been against Jewish law. But you do see swine show up in the Jaredite record. So there's a few like I maybe push back a little bit on that, but I would agree that the law of Moses and all the rituals of the law of Moses is not the emphasis of the Book of Mormon record.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but anyway, I know, for example, when I interviewed Blake Oster, he sees this as probably like a really strong ancient element. This is one where I'm more like, okay, I can see some of the connections to arguing this could be an ancient Hebrew festival, but I'm not going to like die on that hill, and I can see people
Sure.
interpreting it differently. Then, ancient names, Mulek, who's identified as one of the sons of Zedekiah in the Book of Mormon, I believe in the Bible, Malchiah, I think it's spelled with a CH, is identified as being one of the sons of the king. And the king at the time was Zedekiah. I think it was Malchiah ben Hamelech, is how it is in the King James Version. And they found in the 1980s a Paleo Hebrew stamp seal of a royal figure, Malchiahu, son of the king, which would have been Zedekiah because it dates to, around the 6th century BCE. And one of a plausible shortened Hebrew variant would be Mulek. So I see this as linguistically or archaeologically that evidence, or like this is an interesting connection, that Mulek seems to be a plausible shortened name for Malchiahu, which is attested to be the son of King Zedekiah living in the 6th century BCE. I took this from Scripture Central. They're quoting David Noel Friedman, who exclaimed, "If Joseph came up with that one, he did pretty good." So again, I'm not going to go as far as say this is a bullseye, but I definitely think this is very plausible. Not just that Malchiahu is identified as being a son of Zedekiah, but that it dates to the right time. So I see this as, surprising if Joseph Smith just made this up. Don't know if you
Okay.
any comments, or I can go to the next slide. Um, Also,
Yeah.
ancient Hebrew and Egyptian names. I'm just taking this from the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies that Wetnez and Guy and Roper have done. So they pointed to various different either Hebrew or Egyptian names. I did listen to your episode you did with RFM on linguistics about, some of these ancient Semitic languages wouldn't have had vowels. So how do we know that they would have been said this way? I'm not a linguist, so I'm just going off from what I've researched, and I talked to Matthew Bowen, who is a linguist. He says
Hmm.
that linguistic scholars can kind of reconstruct likely how some of these words would have been phonetically sounded out
Sure.
and spoken. So again, there's always a little bit of, is this a direct hit? But some plausibility that some of these names do seem to show up in antiquity, either ancient Hebrew or ancient Egyptian names. And I'll just say quickly something that I find interesting, because whenever I interviewed Matthew Bowen, I asked a question to him because I did a little test. I made up 10 names that sounded either biblical or Book of Mormon-y. And
Hmm.
two of them were actually ancient. I think one was ancient Hebrew and one might have been either ancient Egyptian or ancient Asian. So I said, like, well, if Joseph is making up over 200 proper names, shouldn't we just coincidentally, he'll get some that might have some sort of hit. But what I found interesting about his scholarship is he's talked about wordplays and the meaning of some of these names showing up in the narrative, adding maybe like another layer of complexity or intentionality to it. So a few examples is he suggests the wordplay in Alma 27 on Jershon. It was given to I think it was the Anti-Nephi Lehi's as a place of
Correct. Yep.
inheritance. Jershon means inheritance in Hebrew, so he would see that as like a pun or a wordplay on it. Alma,
This
for
this
example.
to me is actually the most compelling. hit for Book of Mormon historicity. Jershon in particular,
Oh, okay,
I
cool.
I think is a very interesting parallel.
Yeah, some of the other ones maybe not quite as strong, but he talks about how Alma, and he's spoken of being a young man, and Alma, I believe, is the feminine version of Alma, but the masculine of Alma is Elem, and Alma is called a young man, and Elem, which is the masculine form, means young man in Hebrew. Just going off what he said, so I was like, okay, that's a little bit interesting. He also talked about like, King Benjamin's speech. Benjamin means in Hebrew, son of the right hand. And in his sermon, he's teaching people to become sons and daughters to Christ, and that if they're faithful, they'll be at the right hand of God. And then he talks about Nephi. He talks about being born of goodly parents and using puns in his
Hmm.
name like good or fair or beautiful. And they believe that comes from the Egyptian root word nephir, and or nefer. I don't know how you pronounce it. And Bowen builds on the work proposed by John Gee, noting that by Lehi's time, the final weak R in nefer was no longer pronounced, resulting in a vocalization similar to nephi or nephi. I'll just say I'm not an expert in this. I've interviewed Matthew Bowen. Some of the wordplays I think are stronger than others. Some of them,
Hmm.
but I think they're interesting. And for me, I've talked about my theory of translation is predominantly functional translation. But when it would come to names, I would view them as being transliterated. So I find ancient names, but also wordplays on certain names really interesting, and adding another layer of complexity that it's not just an ancient name, but it could be a pun of that name, which might make sense if there was an ancient author. But either you would have to say this is a coincidence, because I don't think Joseph would have known some of this. But any initial thoughts on ancient names and wordplays?
Yeah, but I mean, my initial thought is some of these are compelling. Like I said, I think Jershon, when we were going through and doing our RFM and I were doing our Light and Truth response series, I said Jershon I think is the most compelling. Like if someone asked me, what is the strongest evidence you think for a historical Book of Mormon? Jershon is the example that I go to every time because I don't know how to explain that, hit away. I think the
It's
one.
funny that, because to me, I find it interesting, but that would not be the number one that I would point to. It's interesting that you find that the most compelling. I do think it's quite good. I think it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I think where I'd just push back a little bit, and again, I'm not a linguist either, but there are other names in the Book of Mormon that, like anglicized names like Timothy, there are names that just shouldn't be there at all. And that it's like if we're going to look at the hits, we also have to look at the misses. And I feel like a lot of times the scholarship around the names in the Book of Mormon from the apologetic side only looks at the hits. And then I don't know what to do with the names that like shouldn't exist in the Book of Mormon that are like Greek names. Um, so we would have to look at both of those. And I think when we look at both of those, it's difficult for me to see any of the names as that significant of a piece of evidence. I think my largest feeling on like what's going on with the names is kind of like you suggested you had done with Matthew Bowen is we know that Joseph, well, my position at least is that Joseph Smith was very conversant in the King James Bible. I think it is likely what he was taught to read using, and I think what he's likely doing is either borrowing names from the Bible, remixing on names from the Bible. That's probably the strongest explanation I can give you as far as what's going on is those two things is we have to count both the hits and the misses. I guess I also struggle kind of with the approach from some apologists. Like they'll pick hits from Egyptian, right? So this hit with Nephi is Egyptian. It's difficult for me to understand why Nephi is being named after like a Egyptian pun or an Egyptian play on words if he's a Hebrew from Jerusalem. Yes, I understand the link between Hebrew and Egyptian that comes later in the Book of Mormon's text, but we're talking about when Nephi would have been like a baby, and it's just difficult for me to see a Hebrew naming their kid after, this Egyptian wordplay.
I
So that's
think
kind of my
my
overall
understanding
thought.
is during the time of around 600 BC. My understanding, I think there was an Egyptian influence at that time, because I know there would have been
Sure,
like Judahite scribes and people that would have written in some forms of Egyptian, like hieratic, and so on.
sure.
So I think there would have been some Egyptian influence. So it's possible. But that's an interesting point. I've not really considered that
Yeah,
specifically.
and I understand that influence, and I think it's going to factor into my take on Reformed Egyptian here in just a minute. I just am saying for someone's name in particular, when we think about the importance of names in Hebrew culture, it's really difficult for me to go Nephi, or I'm sorry, Lehi and Sariah are going to name their kid after it, using this Egyptian pun. I can understand because of what we know comes later in the Book of Mormon, but viewing that as like a historical event is just difficult for me. I think it's more likely, you know, seeing a parallel that may or may not fully exist is the way I look at it.
No, and I feel like I can't outright dismiss Matthew Bowen's research and scholarship, but at the same time, I think it's good to be skeptical. And some of these, like you said, I think are stronger, more compelling than
Hmm.
others. And
Hmm.
I want to read through it more. I just find this interesting, and for me, this just adds another layer of complexity that needs to be considered when people are evaluating Book of Mormon
Oh yeah,
historicity. And the
of
last
course.
one I'll talk about is Alma 36, which is, this form of ancient sort of poetic parallelism, not, exclusionary to ancient Hebrews or Semitic languages. You would see some of it in other parts of the world, like in Mesoamerica as well. And I'll also acknowledge that some people see chiasmus as a pure ancient element, like any form of chiasmus in the Book of Mormon proves this is an ancient feature. I don't go that far because I do acknowledge that chiasmus is in the Bible. It's in 19th century works, and there is also some chiasmus, even in the Doctrine and Covenants and in the Book of Abraham. I think I would look at certain chiastic structures, which I see as quite complex and quite intentional. So I would view Alma 36, another I'm going to show you in a minute, as quite complex chiasmus for Joseph to have orally dictated. And I guess if I'm weighing up, do I think it's more likely that an ancient author who, would have been trained in writing in chiasmus wrote this, or Joseph through his own oral capabilities. And for example, there's this analysis done by Edwards and Edwards, and their conclusion is that in both the Pentateuch and the Book of Mormon, that certain chiastic structures, like the long ones, seem to be intentional, whether it was by an ancient or a modern author, whereas some of the ones maybe in the Doctrine and Covenants or the Book of Abraham might show up by chance. So, for example, like in the New Testament, when Jesus says, "Whoever will save his life for my sake will lose it." Oh no, I'm butchering this. And then whoever will lose his life will find it. You know that one. That's not very
Hmm.
compelling chiasmus. Um, but the one I find most intriguing, and this one I'm curious to get your thoughts on, is Helaman 6. And Helaman 6 is a chiastic structure not as long as Alma 36, but at the center of the chiasm, it has Zedekiah and it has Lord. So that doesn't really work in English. But the suffix of Zedekiah, Kaya in Hebrew, means Lord. So if whoever wrote the chiastic structure had this understanding of that Zedekiah, the suffix, means Lord, this would work in the underlying plate language if they're able to preserve this Hebrew name in the Egyptian script. But that, for me, I find quite interesting because it's like either it's a big coincidence or it's not just a complex chiasmus, but this would work if the author knew the meaning of Zedekiah in Hebrew.
Hmm.
I'll just summarize and I'll get your thoughts on this.
Sure.
John Welch says the parallelism between these two names is intriguing not only because Zedekiah was the king and adoptive royal son of Yahweh the Lord, but also because the Hebrew word for Lord, Yahweh, constitutes the final syllable or theophoric suffix Yah at the end of the name Zedekiah. Thus, the central chiastic structure in Helaman 610 actually would have worked better and would have been more obvious in Hebrew than in the English translation. Joseph Smith would have had no way of consciously concocting this parallelism on his own. And I would agree with them. I don't think Joseph would have consciously known that Kaya means Lord in Hebrew. So either this is coincidental, but I think this adds another layer of complexity because it's not just a complex chiastic structure, but this would work in the underlying plate language. Any thoughts on
Hmm.
that?
Um, I mean, so I've looked at some of these chiasms in the past, like in looking at them very specifically. For example, my take on the one in Alma 36 is to have it stated the way that you did, and I know you're just borrowing this from someone else, but to have it delineated like that, if people actually look at the text, it is not as clearly laid out as it is here. And I understand that. Like they're trying to simplify. I'm not saying there's anything untoward saying or going on here. I'm just saying it really doesn't fit as squarely as graphics like this look if you actually look at the text. You have to omit elements, you have to move elements around a little bit, is my memory from going through this specific example. I haven't looked at the specific example in, did you say Helaman 6?
Yes, this one here.
Okay.
Can you see the
So
top? I feel like my panel's in the way. Can I get rid of that?
um
Is my panel
I
blocking it?
just yeah, I just see chiasmus.
Hold on. How do I get rid of this? I feel like there's a. Uh,
Mm.
ah, there we go. Okay, I've hidden it. Can you see it now? Oh no,
Now I
you're
can.
gone now.
Yeah.
I can't see you.
Oh, I'm still here though.
Okay.
Um okay. Yeah, now I can see it. So this one in particular, I'd have to look at the exact text, but I'll just give kind of my overall explanation for what I think about chiasmus, which is, in my view, I think Joseph Smith dictated the Book of Mormon. I think we talked about that last episode, how we both agree. I'm a big fan of Bill Davis's work, Visions in a Seer Stone. I think it's the most compelling explanation for how Joseph Smith created the Book of Mormon's text.
I
And
agree.
I'll just say, as an attorney that has appeared in court and argued cases, in court, presenting information the way that we see chiasmus, or see chiasms, which is this inverted parallelism, is really not that remarkable of a hit to me. As you talked about, it's in the Doctrine and Covenants, it's in other scriptures that we know, Joseph Smith translated, interpreted, revealed, whatever word you want to use. We know it's in other products of Joseph Smith. And to me, what that signals is that Joseph Smith thought the language of Scripture sounded like the King James Bible, and especially like the Pentateuch, which does have chiasms all over it, like you talked about. But especially when we look at the Book of Mormon as an orally dictated text, like an extended oral performance, I think it's very common to, like, I literally teach first year law students when I'm teaching them oral advocacy skills to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. And ultimately, that's really what a chiastic structure is, right? Is you put the center focus in the middle, but you're often introducing material, leading to the apex, and then backing out. It's a lot more difficult when we look at like big chiastic structures. Like I'll absolutely admit that the one in Alma 36 has the 17 different elements. I think that's where people then have to look really carefully, like what has to be omitted to make it fit as squarely as it does in a diagram like that. But my overall explanation for these, Hebrew literary elements is it's difficult for me to see how they count as hits depending on different versions of Book of Mormon translation theories that people take. So, for example, if Joseph, just using your theory as an example, right? If Joseph Smith is more of a participant and interpreting and using language from the King James Bible, it's difficult for me to understand, I guess, in your view, just then those passages are the ones that are translated more directly off the ancient records, or help me understand kind of how you see that, because it feels like those are
Yeah, so I
intentional
would
to
probably see it as the structure could be translated, or that's not the right word. Basically, the structure of what was on the plate would make its way in to the English translation. So it wouldn't
me.
be
Okay.
that it's this big expansion that Joseph is just adding things that weren't on the plate text, but it's more the vocabulary and the words. There was some more flexibility with it, but it would still be trying to maintain the meaning of what was on the plates and adhere to the plate structure. So I would
Okay.
see some of the complex chiasmus as being part of the structure of the Book of Mormon, which some of those would be preserved into the Book of Mormon translation.
Okay. No, I can understand that. I guess that's the place I always get, not with your theory in particular, but that's the place I always get a little bit skeptical about these Hebrew literary elements, is because most people do have to take a broader view of Book of Mormon translation. Then it seems like it's fair, in my mind, to count some of those hits. But I can understand I think I can understand your theory, and it makes sense to me the way you see it.
Okay. Yeah, and overall, like I think with all this, again, like I said at the start, I think it's more the combined cases. I see some plausible, maybe you probably wouldn't agree with evidences, but when it comes to the connections to the Feast of Tabernacles and ancient Hebrew festivals. Then looking at Mulek, I think is probably the strongest of the ancient names. Some of the
Hmm.
ancient Hebrew and Egyptian names, some of the word plays that Matt Bowen is pointing to, like Jershon and Land of Inheritance. And I do find that Helaman 6 chiasmus with Lord and Zedekiah and Kaya meaning Lord in Hebrew, that one I find more compelling. It almost seems like that is intentional, and an ancient author who would have known the meaning of Zedekiah could have put that chiasm together, whereas in English, that wouldn't make as much sense and would
Right.
be quite coincidental. So those things I would probably put as like interesting, plausible, but don't compel belief. But I appreciate some of your perspectives as well on that.
Yeah. Cool.
Cool.
Well,
How are we doing for time?
my
I think we're on two
we
hours. Let's keep
might
going. We're doing well.
yeah, we're doing great. We might have to hit just my next point, and then maybe we can save the third ones for another day,
Okay.
just based on time. But I'm super enjoying this.
Yeah, me
And
too.
actually,
This is
since
fun.
you did literary, this goes well with my literary or kind of literary point. So this is what I call my information density argument against Book of Mormon historicity. So the Book of Mormon, as people know, claims to be written in Reformed Egyptian. So in Mormon 9, this is actually Moroni writing in the Book of Mormon. He's, basically wrapping up the record. He writes, "Condemn me not because of mine imperfection, neither my father because of his imperfection, neither those who have written before him, but rather give thanks unto God that he hath made manifest unto you our imperfections, that you may learn to be more wise than we have been." And this is where it really gets relevant. "And now, behold, we have written this record according to our knowledge in the characters which are called among us the Reformed Egyptian, being handed down and altered by us according to our manner of speech. And if our plates had been sufficiently large, we should have written in Hebrew. But the Hebrew hath been altered by us also. And if we could have written in Hebrew, behold, you would have had no imperfection in our record." The thing that's interesting to me about this passage is that the way I stumbled across this argument, maybe I should frame it this way, is it feels like from the critical side, anytime we point to a particular anachronism, say the numbers involved in the battles, that's going to be my third point, maybe for a future conversation.
Mhm.
Um, there's usually some type of explanation for how that cannot be the case. So I'll be real candid with you and tell you that the way I stumbled across this argument is I was trying to look at the Book of Mormon as a text and say, what parts of this text have to be absolutely, literally, historically true for the text to exist as it exists today? And this is where I came to this part of the Book of Mormon, where the Book of Mormon is making claims for us about the way the Book of Mormon was produced and written and the reason that it was written in the way that it was written. So, implicit in what it's saying here is that they wrote in Reformed Egyptian because Hebrew takes up more space, right? And if our plates would have been sufficiently large, we should have written in Hebrew. That's what it says. And so it must be saying that Reformed Egyptian is more information dense than Hebrew. Let's see if I had anything here. I think this is just kind of reiterating that in Words of Mormon, Mormon and Moroni are very much dealing with this record as a literal record. But you and I have already talked about that. You believe in a literal record that
Yeah.
existed, so not as important. Okay. Now, here's the problem with that is that there is really no form of Egyptian that I've found. And again, I'm not a linguist, but I have talked to a PhD linguist as I've worked on this argument. There's no form of Egyptian that would save space appreciably over Hebrew. And so there are different forms of Egyptian, right? There's hieratic and demotic, which are both developments from the original hieroglyphic form of Egyptian. What I have here is an extract from an Egyptian tale known as the Tale of Two Brothers. It tells the story of Osiris and Anubis, and you can see these different characters. For example, if we just look at the word his, the word his involves, depending on how you count it, right? You can see up to five different characters involved in the word his in Egyptian. When we then go over and we look at Hebrew, I just selected like, the beginning of Genesis 1 1. In the beginning, created God the heavens and the earth, just so that people can kind of see these are different languages. Absolutely. Like Egyptian is very complicated in the sense that there are parts of it that are phonetic. There are parts of it that are logographic. There are parts of it that are like the original idea is that it was ideographic, right? That you're like looking at one character and you can get a lot of text from one character. Um, the thing that's interesting to me about this is like if you just look at comparing one for one, if we were to take one of these phrases, like he made sharp his dagger, he placed it in his hand, that that English sentence requires 41 Egyptian characters to articulate when we look at this example. That becomes 39 English characters. But in Hebrew, that's 33 Hebrew characters. And again, Hebrew in this day didn't use vowels, right? What we see is that the opposite is actually true from what the Book of Mormon claims, that Hebrew actually would have used less characters than Egyptian would have. Now, I grant fully that we don't know what Reformed Egyptian looks like. That's one of the reasons that I've done all of these comparisons to the original hieroglyphic form of Egyptian, because hieroglyphic Egyptian started in like 3000 BC, so well before Nephi's day and age. And I guess my point here is just there really isn't a form of Egyptian that works the way that the Book of Mormon claims. That Hebrew would have appreciably saved space over Egyptian. So here's kind of my overall conclusion, and then I have a second part of this, so I'll pause at this first conclusion for any questions you have.
Yeah.
The author of this text in Mormon 9 has a misunderstanding of the information density of Egyptian compared to Hebrew. This misunderstanding all by itself is completely fatal to the Book of Mormon because this claim is incorporated into the Book of Mormon's narrative about itself. In other words, the way I see it is almost like the Back to the Future problem, right? Like if you change something about something's origin, that thing shouldn't exist. And because these claims in the Book of Mormon are specifically about the way it was written and the manner in which it was produced, in my mind, we really can't go to a looser translation or a conceptual translation of these claims in particular because they have to do with how the Book of Mormon came to be. So the question then is, if those claims are not true, why does the Book of Mormon exist?
Yeah, so I've got a few questions on this because you said that you've, you know, compared Egyptian hieroglyphics and you're saying this applies to Demotic and hieratic and talk to linguists. So I was searching this up because I would agree with you. I think this would be a really strong criticism. I don't think even going to a looser expansionist theory would resolve it. From what I've researched, and I've also asked some like linguists
Mhm,
and Egyptologists about this.
mhm,
And my understanding, I'm not a linguist, but I've just been like searching about this. Is my understanding is that that is correct when it comes to Egyptian hieroglyphics, but that
mhm.
hieratic and demotic would both be more textually dense than Hebrew because within hieratic and certainly demotic, they're more shorthand. There's some logographic characters within it. And I read an article Josh Coates did where he said that um, Hebrew, it's 2.4 English words come from one Hebrew character on average. Um, hieratic would be
Can
2.6,
you
demotic
can you
3.1.
say that number one more time? I'm sorry. You said 2.4 English words out of one character,
Yes,
Hebrew
I think
character?
on average. Yeah,
Hmm.
meaning it required 2.4 English characters per one Hebrew character. Hieratic 2.6,
Oh, okay.
one.
I
And
think you had said word originally. That's why I was confused.
oh, sorry. Yes, I meant character. Sorry, my bad. Yes, character. Good clarification. So from what I've looked at, what I've researched is I think that is correct according to Egyptian hieroglyphics. But what I've looked up is that hieratic and demotic, according to my understanding and what I've looked up, and I checked with an Egyptologist, a faithful Egyptologist about this, and he told me that actually demonic and hieratic would be more logographic and there would be more textual density, more so with demotic than hieratic. And I believe at the time of Lehi, there's examples of, you know, Jews, Judahite scribes who would have written even some text in like hieratic scripts, preserving Aramaic or Hebrew. So I think that's the one where I'm not sure about the evidence for that. And if I'm incorrect or if the research I've gotten this from is wrong, then so be it. But that from what I've researched and asked people about it, they've said that Demotic and Hieratic would be more textually dense than Hebrew.
Yeah, and I completely will admit that I'm not a linguist, and so I am open to correction on this. But as I've looked at it and run these slides by the linguists that I've talked to, I just so that I'm showing that I have done my due diligence, I did
Hmm.
actually do that comparison as well. So what I compared to is looking at the actual Rosetta Stone. Because the significance of the Rosetta Stone, right, is we have this phrase written in Greek, then hieroglyphic, then in Demotic. And so you can kind of see the different writing systems. You can see the units that we would have used to communicate on the Rosetta Stone. And in this particular example, I looked at one phrase, which we'll see on the next slide. So you can kind of see, in Hebrew, you would have 22 letters
Hmm.
to communicate the same as 15 to 25 demotic clusters. Because again, demotic was almost like a form of cursive logographic hybrid Egyptian. It was a language, to my understanding, that was kind of in this transition phase. Hieroglyphic, you have mixed, phonetic, semantic. You've got 25 to 40 signs. When we look at a phrase that's actually on the Rosetta Stone, Ptolemy, beloved of Ptah, has reduced taxes for the people. That phrase takes 51 letters in Greek. It would take 37 signs in hieroglyphic. So we do see condension between demotic and hieroglyphic. You're absolutely right about that. I think the difference is we don't really see an appreciable space saving as relative to Hebrew. So we've got 15 to 25 clusters in demotic and then 22 letters in the biblical form of Hebrew. So you can see, you know, there really isn't an appreciable space saving, at least in this particular example that I've looked at. And I'm mostly just showing you that because we've got two non-linguists talking about linguistics here.
Yeah.
I'm mostly just showing you that so that I can show, like, I have done at least my due diligence in trying to understand, you know, what would disprove my hypothesis.
Okay, fair enough. I would like to bring on someone who has more understanding, but just from what I've researched, because from what I've read, hieratic and demotic are a mix of like logographic, whereas Hebrew is more alphabetic. My understanding
Right.
is certain signs would be more textually dense because a logographic character could produce, numerous words or even a phrase, for example, whereas an alphabetic script would require more characters. I suppose the other theory is that even if they were writing in some sort of version of hieratic or demotic, the Book of Mormon talks about them being reformed or modified over time.
Right.
So they could
Right.
even be a little bit more dense than that. But my understanding, and again, maybe I don't know, check with your linguist friend, is that hieratic and demotic would both be more textually dense than Hebrew. But that's I don't know. I'll need to look into this a bit more. But that's everything that I've
Sure.
read and researched on it. So
Yeah, and so let me continue kind of with the second part of this point for me, at least,
sure.
is that, if you see it the way that I do, we have this demonstrated misunderstanding of the information density of Egyptian relative to Hebrew in the Book of Mormon. And in my view, then the bigger problem is this exact misunderstanding of the way Egyptian works is mirrored in Joseph Smith's understanding of Egyptian that we see in both the Book of Abraham materials and then the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language. So these are snippets from the Joseph Smith papers. The Book of Abraham Manuscript A is the one written by Frederick G. Williams. Book of Abraham Manuscript B is the one written by Warren Parrish. This phrase from the Book of Abraham, I sought for mine appointment unto the priesthood according to the appointment of God unto the fathers concerning the seed. You can see there the two scribes articulate the character in slightly different ways in the actual Book of Abraham manuscripts, but you can see that they're pulling an entire sentence of text from a single Egyptian character. And
Yes.
you can see this gets even worse at different parts of the Kurland Egyptian papers material. Here you've got, it looks like it's two characters to me, but this is an entire paragraph worth of text. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go to that different version of these slides because I think you'll be able to see slightly better. I turned up the contrast on them. Plus, they've got my lovely purple background.
Oh, lovely. Is that the one you use for Let's Disagree?
Yeah, it is.
I like it.
Purple and blue. So here's the ones we looked at. You can, with the contrast turned up, you can see a little bit better the English words. Here you can see those two characters up here in the upper left becomes this entire paragraph of English text. And then I've just put down here by contrast, in the, at least in that hieroglyphic form of that Tale of Two Brothers, you've got these 4 to 5 different characters that are used to spell out just the word his, or to be translated as the word his into English. Here you've got a grouping of characters and an entire paragraph, again, to contrast with brother, which requires multiple different characters. Um, this comes from the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language. I don't know how you stand with regard to, Joseph Smith's involvement with the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, but this note I just pulled
I believe he
directly
was
from the
involved.
scholars. Yeah, and this is so do the people of the Joseph Smith papers, and that's exactly what this quote from them
Because
is
he talks
used
about it
to
in
say.
his journals that he was involved in the project. So although there's some apologists who try to say that this was just W. Phelps, I think the historical sources are clear that Joseph was involved in it as well.
Yeah, and that's all this slide was using. This note, for what it's worth, just comes directly from the people who worked on the Joseph Smith papers, and they see that like even if the scribes were working on this themselves, that Joseph uses it later in his life with regard to the Kinderhook plates to reference
That's right.
when the Kinderhook plates are brought to him. So the issue with the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language is it uses these 5 different degrees. It really has no recognition of the way that Egyptian works at all. There are different languages like Mandarin Chinese that use like tones, but Egyptian is not a language that used any type of degree to like elevate in meaning by slightly changing a character. And it just isn't the way that Egyptian works. So when I'm comparing hypotheses, the way I look at this particular data point is like, not only in my view do we have a misunderstanding of Egyptian that's in the Book of Mormon, that's captured in the way the Book of Mormon says that it's written, it's the exact misunderstanding of Egyptian that I can basically show definitively Joseph Smith had about Egyptian. That's the significance of this piece of evidence to me.
No, I understand that point of view. I think it'd be good for us to come back next time and discuss more about the textual density because from everything that I've researched and what I've asked of people, I would agree with you when it comes to Egyptian hieroglyphics, but my understanding is hieratic would be a little bit more textually dense, demotic would be quite a bit more. But if I'm mistaken on this and what I've looked at and researched, I'd be happy to correct myself on that. I do tend to agree with
Mm-hmm.
you when it comes to the Gale. What I would say briefly is we don't see a Gale when it comes to the Book of Mormon. Joseph might have believed that. He might have thought that one Egyptian character might have produced X amount of English words, sort of
Mm-hmm.
in my theory of translation. Although I do believe when I say it came by revelation, I still believe it's a translation of what was on the text, if that makes
Right.
sense. But I
Right.
believe that the understanding would have be coming through through revelation or through the translation instruments, not that he was actually knowing which character he was translating at that time. But
Right.
interestingly, I don't know if you've ever come across this letter. Jerry Grover was the one that shared it with me by Oliver Cowdery in 1836, where he copies the Book of Mormon and the interpreters of language, and underneath he has two Reformed Egyptian characters. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Do
Mm-hmm.
you want me to show it to you? I think I've got a slide,
Yeah, sure.
just so you can visualize it and people who are watching from current slide. Can you see that?
Yes.
So it has here the Book of Mormon, and it has two characters, and it has the interpreters of language and two characters. Now, this is coming from Oliver Cowdery, so the assumption is that he's likely getting this from Joseph Smith, but we don't know that for absolute certain. But it has two characters producing the Book of Mormon, and then other two characters producing the interpreters of language.
Hmm.
So Jerry would see it as again, I don't know if this is, actually correct as a translation, but he would see it that in that scenario that we have two characters producing like 4 words, which would fit more with that sort of like a logographic script.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't see like one character when it comes to the Book of Mormon producing like 20, 25 words, for example. I do think there's some statements from some eyewitnesses who talk about like one character would appear on the stone, then followed by lots of English translation. But I've already told you that I think it's possible Joseph might have told them that, but I sort of think that's what they were hypothesizing or reconstructing, and
Yeah.
theories might have come, like especially a lot of them are coming decades later. Um, but I think I would just say briefly to that is that we should come back and discuss because if I'm wrong, then I think you've got a strong argument. If you're wrong, then it might undermine it. But I believe that Demotic and hieratic, especially hieratic, would have existed at the time, 600 BCE in
Hmm.
Jerusalem. Apologists have pointed to like Papyrus Amherst 63, been written by Judahite scribes. It was like I think it's like Aramaic, but with hieratic, or is it Demotic?
Right.
I can't remember. Demotic
It
characters.
was, I'm pretty sure it was demotic. Yeah, because I've
Okay,
looked at
yeah.
this.
So they would say that if they brought the brass plates with them, which claimed to have been written in Egyptian, and if Lehi was trained in, I think it's the language of Egyptians and the learning of the Jews, then there could have been some either hieratic or Demotic script that they could have had. And then over time, languages evolved. There could have been some modification. I don't know if how much you've looked into Jerry's theory. I'm cautious with it because I'm not a linguist. He's not a linguistic scholar, so I'm very tentative about it. But his theory, because I've done a couple episodes with him on it, he sees the Book of Mormon characters as being a mix of like hieratic and a bit of Demotic and a little bit of like Hebrew and like Mayan glyphs. But again, I'm tentative, when it comes to his translation. But he would see it as that there's been a modification over time, and it's more of a logographic script. So it would be more textually dense, which scripts can evolve and modify a bit over time. But yeah, that's I think all I have to say
They
for now.
they do, but so they do, and I agree with you that we absolutely see condensing from hieroglyphic to hieratic and demotic. I think the question is, do we see appreciable space saving relative to Hebrew? And my understanding, looking at direct examples, is that we really don't. But like you said, yeah, I'm more than happy to be corrected on this because I'm not a linguist, and definitely want to be sensitive to people's expertise. I have looked at Jerry's theory. I think it is very creative. I think that's the best way I can put it for
The most
you.
charitable way you can put it.
Yeah. I mean, he's clearly done a ton of work on it.
Oh yeah, and he went through it. We did like 2 or 3 episodes on it, and I have to admit, like a lot of it was just going beyond me. So I do not have the expertise to say yay or nay to it, but I think it's fascinating. I was like, whenever I first heard about it, I was like, what the heck? Someone's done like a attempted translation of the characters document. Like this is nuts.
The one last thing I'll say about the general information density, and I'll pull up this better version of these slides for this just really quickly, and then we can wrap up,
Mhm.
is just because I probably should have tread this ground when we originally covered it. So yeah, here's just some background on like these three different Egyptian scripts that we've been referencing, right? Hieroglyphic began being used around 3000 BC, continued to be used until 400 CE. It's the formal monumental writing. It's information density, longer efficiency for long text. Then when we look at hieratic, it begins being used around the same time period. But like you talked about, yes, I acknowledge this would have been likely the form of Egyptian that could have been used in Lehi's day. It was a cursive form of hieroglyphics used for everyday writing. It's more compact than hieroglyphics,
Yeah.
reduces the visual complexity while preserving similar linguistic content. And then demotic, which is what's actually on the Rosetta Stone, this is from the Rosetta Stone itself, becomes more abstract and a streamlined script used for legal, commercial, and daily documents. This is actually what's on the Rosetta Stone itself, just so that people can kind of see how the information density works, right? The top line being the hieroglyphic, the middle being the demotic, and then the bottom being what's in Greek. And Greek is a good stand-in for Hebrew because it's also uses an alphabet. The difference is that Greek doesn't, Hebrew is a consonantal alphabet at this time period, and Greek is not. So Greek would have used more letters than potentially what Hebrew would have used. And I know I've gone over this. One of the ways that Ptolemy, or I'm sorry, Champollion cracked the code is that names themselves, in at least in hieroglyphic, had to be spelled out phonetically. And these little symbols up here in the upper right is what's called a cartouche, which basically delineates to the reader you're supposed to read this. You're supposed to read this phonetically. Anyways, so we would expect to see some condensing, you're right, but I just am not sure it's what the Book of Mormon basically contemplates. That's kind of my overall. I just wanted to make clear so that I don't get attacked for misstating, misstating how Egyptian works.
So am I right in thinking, are you arguing that there might be more textual density, that it might be more textually dense if they used even hieratic or demotic, but it wouldn't be substantially more? Or are you saying that
Exactly.
Hebrew? Okay, so you're saying that it might be, but it wouldn't be substantially a big difference. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that it would more or less be the same,
Be similar.
especially
Okay.
when, yeah, it would more or less be the same when you're using either hieratic or demotic relative to Hebrew, especially consonantal Hebrew.
I see. Okay. That's a good clarification. And it'll be good for next episode. But from what I've researched, I think hieratic and Hebrew are quite similar. I think hieratic is a little bit more dense because it's got some like logographic symbols,
Hmm.
and demotic they would see more. But I'm willing to be corrected, and it might be good for us to look into that more
Sure.
for next time. Do you have any closing thoughts? I think we're going to leave the third one to the next episode because we've gone over 2 hours. But I think it's better to go longer so we can actually have more of a back and
Me
forth
too.
discussion and
No,
not rush it.
I'll just end and say like I can absolutely understand why people see the parallels as compelling. Like I absolutely can. Like I believed in the Book of Mormon for the better part of my life. Like I believed in a historical Book of Mormon for the better part of my life. I can also understand why people see it as uh, people like you who have openly told me like you've had spiritual experiences with the Book of Mormon, and so while the evidence may present some compelling parallels for you, I think you open by saying like you admit that the evidence itself is not enough probably to reach the historicity question, and then it's in the backdrop of kind of faith and spiritual experiences that it gets you there. I can absolutely understand that viewpoint. I had it myself, for 35 years. So I don't want my comments looking at historicity to be viewed as like me attacking anyone's faith or saying that I can't see it the opposing way. I guess when I just apply, in my view, when I just apply the same level of skepticism I would to any other historical claim, these are some of the bars that I see to viewing the Book of Mormon as historical. That said, I have super appreciated this conversation. Like I said, I'm more than willing to come back and finish our third point. I know mine deals with expected archaeological evidence based on the text, and I'm excited for it. I honestly, Stephen, I have a ton of respect for you. I really appreciate that we've been able to have the conversations that we have had, and I think today is no exception. It basically shows that we can view Book of Mormon historicity very differently, even though it feels like sometimes we agree a lot, maybe just differ in the interpretation. I think it shows that you can have these types of conversations between a believer and a non-believer where nobody is playing gotcha, nobody's
Yeah.
lying. Both of us have been very willing to say, I don't know, I might be wrong about this. And if so, I'm open to more information. Um, I just really appreciate the space to have a conversation with you about this because I hope, if nothing else, it'll help your believing audience understand that, like, I don't see the Book of Mormon as not historical because I hate the church or because I hate the Book of Mormon or because I hate Joseph Smith. I legitimately just don't see the evidence for its historicity overcoming some of the bars to seeing it as historical.
No, I appreciate that perspective, and I feel like often believers and apologists don't like to concede, but to be intellectually honest and consistent, I do see that there are some historical challenges against the Book of Mormon and criticisms that aren't easy to reconcile. I'm also in the camp, as I've shared, that I see some plausible and interesting evidences, but as you stated, it's not enough to remove the requirement of faith, and primarily the reason that I do believe is spiritual experiences. I don't know if I didn't have those experiences, I don't know if this alone would really convince me. I don't see it as definitive. And I think these conversations are valuable because I also think you come from a place of some epistemic humility as well. And I try to have that, being like, this is my understanding. I could be wrong, and willing to shift my position based on more evidence or argumentation, or to refine our positions, even though we come to our different interpretations. And
Mhm.
I think there just needs to be more of a willingness to talk to the other side. I'll admit, before our first conversation, I was a little bit hesitant, worried that, oh man, this is going to be pretty, what if this gets combative and heated? And what if it turns into gotchas? And I think there is that fear of not wanting to talk to the other side, viewing them as like, well, you're the anti-Mormon, you hate the church, you're the enemy. And I think whenever we talk together and have these respectful dialogues, you feel less intimidated and you feel like, oh, we can have a respectful discussion, even though we come from different points of view. And,
Mhm.
we can say things to challenge or refine our positions, but we can do it in a way that can be respectful, not disrespectful. Um, and I think that's important. I hope more of these dialogues happen. And I'll just say, like, we've got more to talk about with Book of Mormon historicity. But I find the discussions and the debates about the Book of Mormon fascinating intellectually. I'm fascinated by the Book of Mormon, either naturalistic translation theories. I'm fascinated by evidence in favor, evidence against, because I think we're all trying to come up with a model and theory that best accounts for the data and evidence that we see. And we're all going to
Mhm.
interpret certain things differently, and certain things might fit more with the other. And I sort of see the Book of Mormon as it's a bit of a puzzle. And I feel like I want to value the perspectives and views of critics like Dan Vogel, William Davis, Ganesh, in our recent conversations, yourself, and also faithful scholars who have written a lot on it, and to try to incorporate as much as I can from both sides. And I think to be charitable to people who come to a different conclusion or interpretation, I feel like I can totally understand why you are not compelled or convinced by some of the evidence that I brought forward. But I appreciate that you've been respectful to why someone like myself, a believer, might find some of it interesting or plausible, while not viewing it as definitive. So I think this has been a good conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too, Stephen. Thank you so much.
Awesome. You enjoyed the rest of your day. And listeners, if you enjoyed it, give it a like, comment, share, subscribe, and also come back for our part 4, where we're going to finish on Book of Mormon historicity, and check out Kolby's channel as well. Let's Disagree. And I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.